A local hunter would have walked right past this dead she-wolf. Damn it, the meat was spoiled. There were bony growths on her ribs. But this man crouched down beside her, pulled out a dull knife, and smiled. Because in a past life, he had been a butcher, and he knew for sure that this carcass would save a dying child. But let's rewind. First comes the cold. Not winter's cold, the kind that comes from within, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of his body and never returned. Then the smell hits him. Rotten straw, smoke, the sour stench of a man who hasn't been fed in a long time. Daniel throws his eyes open and stares at the soot-stained beams, a low ceiling. It's not his own. He tries to sit up and freezes. His body won't obey him. His arms are thinner. His shoulders are narrower. The calluses on his palms are in the wrong places. These are the fingers of a man who held a bow, not a knife. In the corner, a child is coughing, a small, hoarse cough. Daniel turns his head. On a cot against the wall lies a thin woman of about 28, clutching a girl of about 5 to her chest. The girl stares at him with huge eyes without a trace of fear. Just a question. And she whispers that Daddy mustn't leave again. She begs him to stay. The memory hits him like a blow. Someone else's. Aiden Court. A hunter, 34 years old. The village of Hollow End. His wife, Myra. His daughter, Annie. A week ago, he went into the woods and came back empty-handed. Of the 300 people in the village, 43 remain. The Lord has struck them from the rolls. No food, no soldiers, no help. 3 months until winter. And the last thing Daniel remembers from his life is the icy ramp at the back entrance of the restaurant, a deer carcass on his shoulder. His legs give way. His temple slams into the curb. And one thought. Lily is waiting for him in the morning for pancakes. He promised. He won't be there. The little girl starts coughing again. Daniel drops his head between his knees. Strangers' hands on a stranger's body in a strange world tremble. And then he starts counting, quietly, like after a disastrous shift when the kitchen is in chaos and everything has to be put back together. He has hands. He looks at the wall. A knife hangs there, dull, old. The blade is worn down crookedly, but it's a knife. Outside the window is a forest. Something lives in the forest. For 15 years, he'd been dissecting what others brought in. He knows the 220 muscles of an ungulate by heart. By the smell of the liver, he could tell what the animal had been eating for the past week. Every joint, every tendon, every spot where the knife slides in effortlessly. He's never hunted on his own. He's a butcher, but right now, being a butcher is all he has. Daniel stands up. He walks over to the cot. He drops to his knees and places his palm on the girl's forehead. She's burning up. Her skin is dry and thin, nothing but bones beneath it. He knows what a child like this needs. Not meat. Meat would kill a stomach unaccustomed to it. She needs broth. A long simmered broth, made from the skull, with fat, with a bitter herb to boost the iron in her blood, simmered for 12 hours over coals. He whispers to her that Daddy is going into the woods now. He'll bring back real broth, with fat, and all she has to do is breathe and wait. The girl nods. Mira looks at him as if seeing him for the first time. The old Aiden didn't talk like that. The old Aiden used to yell. He'd slam his fist on the table. He'd come home drunk or angry. But this one is on his knees, quietly talking about broth and fat. Daniel takes a knife off the wall. In his Chicago kitchen, he would have thrown one like this away without a second thought. But there isn't another one. He walks out. The village lies before him like an open wound. 12 houses, half of them with collapsed roofs. The vegetable gardens are empty. The ground is gray, like ash. A forest rises behind the village. The trees stand thick and crooked. Their trunks are twisted. The bark is swollen with bumps. The leaves have a yellowish, rotten tinge. Even the air coming from the forest feels heavy, slightly sweet. That's how meat smells on the third day in the warmth. 2 years ago, a squad of the Count's gamekeepers entered this forest. 8 men. Only one came out, without an arm. He told of a bear the size of a wagon, of bony growths on its skull as thick as a palm, of how arrows bounced off its hide. The locals call him Gray. He's been living in the thicket for 10 years, and no one dares touch him. But Daniel doesn't need a bear. He needs a carcass. Any carcass, even a dead one. He's not a hunter. He's a butcher. He needs bones. An old man calls out to him from behind. Skinny, hunchbacked, leaning on a stick. He says you can't go into the forest, that no one ever comes back from there. Daniel asks his name. The old man is taken aback. He replies that his name is Ben, and that Aiden knows that very well. Daniel nods. He agrees that going into the woods is dangerous, but Annie has a fever, and if she doesn't get some bone broth by morning, she'll be buried in 3 days. Ben opens his mouth, closes it. Then he brings a rope, old but sturdy, about 20 meters long. Daniel takes the rope and enters the forest. It grows dark immediately beneath the sickly tree canopies. The light falls in yellow and gray patches. The ground beneath his feet is soft, too soft, as if it's rotting from the inside. He walks slowly, not out of fear. He doesn't know this forest. In Chicago, the carcasses came to him already on hooks, clean, bleeding dry, with the health inspector's stamp. Here, there are no hooks, no inspectors. Here, there's a 200-year-old curse and beasts with bony growths. He wanders for 3 hours. Aiden's memory offers only fragments, trails, a watering hole by a split rock, a ravine beyond which the wolves begin. Everything is blurry, like a dream you forget even as you're telling it. And then, in a clearing by a fallen tree, he finds what he was looking for. A dead she-wolf, a large one, gray fur with brown spots. She was killed by something larger. Her throat is torn open. Her side is ripped open. The predator ate and left. The carcass has been lying there no more than a day. And here we return to the beginning. A local would have walked right past it. The meat has been touched. The hide is covered in blood. A cursed beast. Bony growths the size of a finger on its ribs. Lumps under the hide on its neck. 2 rows of extra teeth at the back of its jaw. Anyone would say the carcass is useless and dangerous. Daniel pulls out a knife and gets to work. His hands remember. Even someone else's hands remember. It's not the body's memory. It's knowledge. 15 years at the cutting table. He flips the carcass onto its back. He finds the entry point. The knife is dull. He has to press hard. But he knows where to press. The first cut runs down from the sternum. He mustn't damage the intestines. He cuts open the abdomen and freezes. Inside is not what he expected. The liver, kidneys, and spleen are all in place. But next to the left kidney sits a growth. Dense, black-green, the size of a fist. And the tissue around it is darker and stiffer, as if the growth is drawing something out of the flesh and changing it. Daniel freezes. He's never seen anything like this on a single carcass in his entire career. But he's seen tumors, abscesses, infected lymph nodes on deer from bad farms. The principle is the same. There's a focus. There's an affected area. Between them is a border. Cut out the focus cleanly, don't touch the border, and the rest of the flesh will be healthy. He leans in. He sniffs the growth. Sour, pungent, like vinegar mixed with metal. Not rot and not an infection. Something else. He cuts it out, slowly, with a dull knife, taking 4 times as long as necessary. He separates the growth from the kidney, finds a second one at the base of the skull, a third in the groin near a lymph node. He removes each one whole without cutting it open. He places them on a burdock leaf. 3 growths, 3 sources. The rest of the carcass smells normal. The liver is dark but not bitter. The kidneys are intact. He takes the liver, both shin bones, the tongue, the fat from the kidneys. He discards the rest. He can't carry much. He trudges back for 2 hours. The bones are heavy. His body is weak. Ben is waiting for him at the edge of the forest. He's sitting on a stump and won't leave. He sees Daniel. He sees the bones and the meat. He opens his mouth, but says nothing. Daniel walks past him into the house. Annie is asleep. Myra sits motionless by the cot. She looks at the bones in his hands, then at him, and in her eyes is something that wasn't there this morning. Not hope, fear. She's afraid to believe it. Daniel places the bones by the hearth. He stokes the fire. He finds a cracked clay pot, but it holds water. He splits the shin bones lengthwise. With a dull knife, it takes 40 minutes and leaves his fingers scraped raw. But he splits them. The marrow inside is yellow, fatty, good. He puts the bones in the pot, pours in water, sets it over the coals. Not a boil, a simmer. You can't boil the broth. If it boils, the fat will emulsify and the broth will turn cloudy. It needs a slow heat, 12 hours. He goes outside. He finds wild garlic by the stream, bitter, wild, but it contains iron. He peels the bark off a rowan tree. The inner layer is bitter, but it has what he needs. He throws everything into the pot. He sits down by the hearth. Every hour he skims off the gray, dirty scum. For the first 3 hours, it rises thickly, then less frequently. By the 6th hour, the broth lightens in color. By the 10th, it turns golden. Mira is awake. She watches as he sits by the fire, stirring the broth with a wooden spoon. How he sniffs the steam and nods to himself. how he won't go to sleep. Toward morning, Daniel takes the pot off the heat. He strains the broth through a rag, pours it into a bowl, tastes it. Hot, thick, rich, with a hint of bitterness from garlic and rowan berries. Not restaurant quality, rough, but it has everything he needs. Fat, minerals, collagen, iron, protein from the brain. He lifts Annie up. She's warm and light as a bird. He brings the bowl to her lips. The first spoonful. The girl grimaces. It's bitter. He blows on the broth and feeds it to her in small sips. She drinks a quarter of the bowl and falls asleep. He hands the bowl to Myra. She takes it with both hands, takes a sip, and freezes. She drinks for a long time, taking small sips. Tears stream down her cheeks, but she doesn't make a sound. Daniel doesn't ask why she's crying. He knows. It's the taste of broth that's never been in this house before. The taste of someone sitting by the fire for 12 hours for your sake. Mary finishes drinking. She sets the bowl down. She looks at him and says she doesn't know what happened to him in the forest. But he's different. Completely different. Daniel doesn't answer. He lies down by the hearth and closes his eyes. His last thought isn't about the forest or the animals. It's about Lily, his daughter from his past life. She was waiting for pancakes. He didn't come. But Annie is here, and Annie got her broth. By morning, the girl's fever had broken, for the first time in a month. Daniel woke up because someone was watching him. He opened his eyes. Annie was sitting on the cot, alone. She wasn't lying down. She was sitting. Her eyes were clear, not cloudy like yesterday. She said she wanted more of that bitter soup. Daniel sat up. His whole body ached. His back, his arms, his scraped fingers throbbed. But he sat up and looked at the girl. 5 years old, blonde hair, a face gaunt from hunger. But her eyes were alive. He told her she'd get some soup, but first she needed to drink some water. Just water. Myra was no longer asleep. She was sitting against the wall, watching Annie talk. Myra's face had the expression of someone afraid to look away, for fear that everything might vanish. Daniel stood up. He walked out of the house. The morning was gray, just like everything else here. The sky over Hollow End looked as if it had been covered with an old sheet. He walked over to the stream. He scooped up some water. On his way back, Old Man Ben stopped him. Ben was standing by his house and said he hadn't slept all night because he'd seen Daniel building a fire and cooking something. He asked what he had been cooking from that damned beast. Daniel replied that he had been making broth from the bones. Ben looked at him as if he'd confessed to witchcraft. He said you couldn't eat the meat of those damned beasts, that it made people sick. That 5 years ago, Garth the carpenter had eaten the liver of a damned pig and died a week later in convulsions. Daniel paused. He looked at Ben. He said that Garth didn't die from the meat. Garth died because he ate the liver along with the glands that contain the poison. That the poison isn't in the meat. The poison is in specific places. The adrenal glands, the lymph nodes at the base of the skull, the growths. Remove them, and the meat is safe. Ben stared at him with his mouth agape. Then he asked how Aiden knew this. Daniel said he just knew, that was all. That if Ben wanted, they could talk about it later. But right now, he had to get back to the forest, because one wolf carcass was enough for broth for 2, and there were 43 people in the village. He returned home. He gave the water to Myra. He warmed up the leftover broth for Annie. While the girl was drinking, he examined the knife. Dull. Useless for serious work. He needed a different tool. He went out and walked around the village. 12 houses. 8 were inhabited. 4 were abandoned. He went into every abandoned house. In the third, he found a rusty cleaver, heavy, with a wide blade. The rust was superficial. The metal beneath it was intact. For an hour, he sharpened the blade on a stone by ram. Old Man Ben came over and sat down beside him. He said nothing. He watched as Daniel sharpened the knife with steady strokes, always away from himself, always at the same angle. Ben said his hands didn't move like a hunter's. Daniel didn't answer. When the cleaver was sharp, he tested the blade on a hair from his forearm. The hair fell off. Good. Not perfect, but a working tool. He took the rope. He took the machete. He took the old knife as a backup, and he went into the forest. This time, he was walking with a purpose. Yesterday's she-wolf had told him a lot. He'd butchered her for more than just meat. He studied her. From the condition of her muscles, he realized the pack didn't roam far. The territory was small. The she-wolf was nursing. That meant the den was nearby. From the contents of her stomach, he determined that the pack fed on small game, hares, perhaps foxes. They didn't take large prey. That meant the pack was weak, 3 or 4 wolves, no more. From the wear on their teeth, he determined their age. A young pack, 2nd or 3rd season, not yet experienced. All of this, the dead she-wolf from yesterday told him through her bones, muscles, and teeth. He was heading toward the watering hole. Aiden's memory reminded him of a split rock an hour and a half's walk away. There, the stream made a bend and formed a backwater. The animals come to drink at dawn and at sunset. It was now noon, 5 hours until sunset. There was plenty of time. He reached the split rock in 2 hours. Aiden's legs were weak, and Daniel was tiring faster than he'd expected. At the backwater, he stopped and looked around. Tracks. Paw prints in the soft earth by the water. Wolf tracks. Fresh. He crouched down and looked at them. 4 different sizes. 4 wolves. One larger than the rest. A male. They come to the water regularly. The trail is well trodden. Daniel set to work. He found a spot between 2 trees on the trail leading to the watering hole. He dug a hole, with a blunt knife in his hands, knee deep. Not deep enough to trap a wolf, but deep enough to make it stumble. He stretched a rope at ankle height between the tree trunks. He tied it fast. He checked the tension. He camouflaged it with leaves. He stepped back. He looked at it. Not good. Any experienced hunter would spot the trap from 3 steps away. But wolves aren't hunters. Wolves follow the trail to the watering hole because that's the way they went yesterday. He moved 30 steps away from the trap. He climbed a tree. Not high, just 2 meters. That was enough. He sat down on a thick branch, a machete in his hand, and he began to wait. He sat in the tree for 3 hours, motionless. His legs were numb. His back ached. The mosquitoes were eating him alive. In Chicago, the longest wait had been an hour and a half, when he was waiting for a delivery of marbled beef from Nebraska and the truck got stuck on the highway. Here, the stakes are higher. Here, instead of beef from Nebraska, there's a damned wolf with a double row of eyes. The sun began to set. The light in the forest grew denser, golden gray. Daniel heard them before he saw them. Footsteps, light ones. 4 pairs of paws on the soft earth. They emerged onto the trail one by one. The first, a large male. Gray fur with bony growths along his spine. Eyes, 2 rows. The lower ones were normal. The upper ones were small and immobile. They looked to the sides, like extra mirrors. Behind him came the second, the third, the fourth. A female, smaller than the others. She was limping on her left hind leg. They were heading toward the water, calmly, along their usual route. The male led the way. He didn't watch his step. Why should he? He'd walked this trail hundreds of times. His front paw caught on a rope. He swayed. The front half of his body began to sink. His left paw fell into a hole. The wolf snarled, not from pain, but from surprise. He began to pull himself out, then jumped, 2 meters down. He landed hard. His knees throbbed with pain, but he was already moving. The she-wolf from yesterday had told him where this beast's weak spot was. Not in the throat, not in the head. The bony protrusions on the skull were too thick. A knife wouldn't work. The weak spot was behind the front right shoulder blade. That's where the bony growths parted, between the 3rd and 4th ribs. The muscle was thinner there. The blood vessels are closer to the surface. The wolf was still standing in the pit when the cleaver sank behind its right shoulder blade. Daniel struck from top to bottom, with all his weight. The blade slipped between the ribs and pierced the lung. The wolf jerked. It spun around. Its jaw passed within a centimeter of Daniel's face. The second row of teeth, small, sharp. Daniel jumped back. He fell. He rolled away. The wolf took 2 steps out of the pit. Blood was gushing from beneath his shoulder blade. His lung was punctured. He took a 3rd step and lay down. The other 3 wolves stood 10 steps away. They watched. Daniel lay on the ground and looked at them, the machete in his hand, blood on the blade. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The 3 wolves were staring at him. He stared back at them. Then the female, the one that was limping, turned and walked away. The second one followed her, the third. They didn't fight. A pack without a leader doesn't fight. It's leaving. Daniel waited until they disappeared among the trees. Then he sat up. His hands were shaking. He felt sick from the fear that had come afterward. At the restaurant, after a grueling shift, he'd go out onto the ramp and smoke, staring at the wall. There's no wall here. There's a dead wolf with bony growths, and 3 living ones somewhere in the darkening forest. He gave himself 10 minutes. Then he stood up and started working. Butchering. That's what he knows how to do. He's at home here. Even in a strange forest, in a strange body, with a dull cleaver. When his hands rested on the carcass, the world became simple and clear. The first cut. The hide. Muscles beneath it. Familiar. A wolf's anatomy is similar to a dog's, adjusted for size and the growths. He worked methodically. He removed the hide. He cut open the belly. He found the growths. 4 of them, more than the female had. 2 near the kidneys, 1 at the base of the skull, 1 in the chest cavity near the heart. This wolf had only 1 heart, not 2 as he'd expected. So not all of those cursed beasts have a second heart, or at least not wolves. He made a mental note. Every carcass is a textbook. Every detail is information for the next hunt. He took as much as he could, both hind legs, the liver, kidneys without growths, ribs, the spine in pieces, fat. He tied it all up with a rope. Heavy, very heavy. He dragged the meat through the woods for 2.5 hours. It was already dark. He stopped twice. He lay down on the ground and caught his breath. Then he got up and dragged it on. Ben was waiting for him at the edge of the forest, with a torch. The old man was sitting on the same stump. He saw Daniel. He saw the meat. Silently, he took a portion. They carried it the rest of the way together. The village was still awake. Mira was standing in the doorway. Annie was sitting by the window, her face pressed against the glass. Daniel entered the house and set the meat down by the hearth. Myra looked at the meat, then at him, at his blood-stained hands, at his face, gray with exhaustion. She asked if the meat was cursed. Daniel said it had been. Not anymore. She didn't understand. He didn't bother explain. Not now. Right now, he was slicing the liver into thin strips. He seared them on a flat stone over the fire, with wild garlic. No salt. There was no salt. The liver was for Myra, not for Annie. It was too early for Annie. Her stomach wasn't ready yet. For Annie, it was broth again. He put the bones on the fire, a second batch of broth, another 12 hours, and he gave the liver to Myra. She picked up a slice with her fingers, took a bite, closed her eyes. The taste of meat on the tongue of a person who hadn't eaten anything but liquid broth for 2 days. That's the taste of life. It's quelly. The body receives what it has been lacking for months and sends a signal to the brain so powerful that a person cannot help but cry. Myra didn't cry. She finished eating in silence. Then she looked at Daniel and asked why he had given it to her first instead of himself. Daniel didn't answer. He was already lying on the floor by the hearth, asleep. In the morning, he woke up to a knock on the door. Standing in the doorway was Griffin Wake, the village elder, a burly man in his 50s with a weather-beaten face, a graying beard, and tired, wary eyes. Behind him stood 3 others, a man and 2 women. Griffin said that Ben had told everyone that Aiden had brought meat from the forest, cursed meat, and was feeding it to his wife and daughter. Daniel stood in the doorway, looking at the village elder. Griffin spoke calmly, but beneath that calm lay steel. For 5 years he had held the village together, on a word of honor, on shared grief, on the fact that no one panics and everyone shares what little there is. And now, here comes a butcher who drags a carcass out of the damned forest and cooks broth from the very thing that's killing people. This is either salvation or the end. Daniel asked Griffin to come in. Griffin entered. Daniel led him to the hearth. 4 growths lay on a flat stone by the hearth, black and green, solid. Daniel picked one up. He showed it to Griffin. He explained, "This is poison. It's found in specific places, the adrenal glands, the lymph nodes, and the bone growths. Remove them properly, and the meat is safe." Garth the carpenter died because he ate it all together, without knowing. I don't blame him. He just didn't know. Griffin listened in silence. Then he asked how Aiden knew this. Daniel paused. He said he couldn't explain it, but he could show him. He suggested that Griffin eat some broth. If he didn't get sick in 3 days, that would be the answer. Griffin looked at the bowl of broth, then at Annie, who was sitting on the cot eating a piece of bread soaked in the broth. Yesterday, this girl couldn't even stand up. Today, she's sitting and eating. Griffin took the bowl. He drank it, hardly, in one long gulp. He set it down on the floor. He said that if nothing happened to him in 3 days, they'd have a serious talk, and he left. 3 days later, nothing had happened to Griffin. He came back. He sat down across from Daniel and said one word: teach. Griffin brought 2 people with him. A guy named Tom, 22 years old, thin, wiry, a farmer's hands, silent, eyes downcast. Standing next to him was a girl, redhead, freckles all over her face, strong hands. Her shoulders were broader than Tom's. She looked straight at Daniel without blinking. Griffin said this was his daughter, Sadie. Daniel looked at her. Sadie said she wanted to learn, that she'd gone into the woods with a bow on her own, that she wasn't afraid. Daniel nodded. He asked if she knew how to hold a knife. Sadie replied that she knew how to cut bread. Daniel said that wasn't the same thing. He led them out of the village to a stream. It was a cold morning. Fall was approaching. The air smelled of wet earth and something sour from the forest. Daniel took out yesterday's hare, an ordinary one, not a cursed one. Small, gray. It had been caught in a snare at the edge of the forest. He laid the carcass on a flat rock. He stood over it and began to speak. He spoke as if he were in the kitchen, just as he'd explain things to the trainees at the restaurant, calmly, precisely, without unnecessary words. A hare has 62 muscles. 23 of them are major. Each muscle attaches to the bone at a specific point. The knife follows the bone, not across the muscle. Whoever cuts across tears the fibers and loses the juices. Whoever cuts along the bone removes the meat in one prom. He demonstrated the first cut, along the spine from the neck to the pelvis. The knife glided smoothly, effortlessly. The meat separated from the bone on its own because the knife was moving in the right direction. Tom watched with his mouth agape. Sadie leaned in closer. Her eyes followed the blade as if it were a living thing. Daniel separated the hind legs. He pointed out the joint. The knife doesn't chop through the joint. The knife finds the gap between the bones and slides through it. Cartilage is soft. Bone is hard. Why cut through the bone when there's cartilage right next to it? He handed the knife to Tom. Tom took it. His hands were shaking. He tried to copy the motion. It was crooked, rough. He tore a muscle. Daniel didn't scold him. He said, "It's always like that the first time, that it takes 20 carcasses for your hand to get the hang of it." He handed the knife to Sadie. Sadie held the knife differently, confidently, low to the ground, as if she were holding a weapon rather than a tool. Daniel corrected her grip. He said a butcher's knife isn't a sword. You hold it with your fingers, not your fist. The pressure comes from the wrist, not the shoulder. Sadie took over. She made the cut. The line came out smoother than Tom's. The muscle didn't tear. Daniel looked at her hand, then at her face. He said in front of Tom that Sadie's hand was more precise, that she needed to work on fine incisions, the hyoid bone, the bursae, things that require patience, not strength. Sadie blushed to her ears. Tom nodded. He wasn't offended. He'd seen the same thing Daniel had. The next day, Daniel went into the woods with a cleaver and 2 knives. Within a week after the first wolf, he killed 2 more. Not from the same pack, different ones, solitaries. Each one caught in a trap. Each one he butchered right there. He read the carcasses like books. The second wolf told him it had been feeding on fish from the stream, so the stream was still flowing. There were fish. The third wolf was old. Its muscles were stiff. Its teeth were severely worn. It had larger distortion knots, 6 instead of 4. So the older the beast, the deeper the distortion. That's important. Daniel memorized every detail. He brought the meat of the second and third wolves back to the village. He butchered them in front of everyone. He showed them the nodes. He showed them how to cut them out. Tom watched in silence, taking it all in. Sadie asked questions. Why was this not near the kidney and not the liver? Why did the old wolf have more of them? Why sniff the growth before cutting it out? Daniel answered every question. A week later, the village ate the meat. Not everyone. Not everyone dared to try it. Out of 43 people, 26 ate it. The rest watched and waited. They waited for someone to get sick, for someone to fall into convulsions like Garth the Carpenter 5 years ago. No one got sick. 2 weeks later, everyone was eating it. Daniel began building a smokehouse. He knew fresh meat wouldn't keep. It was fall. It would get cold in a month. He needed a smokehouse. He needed salt. There was no salt. He remembered. At a restaurant in Chicago, he'd worked with different kinds of salt. Sea salt, rock salt, smoked salt. But there was no sea here and no rock salt mines. There was a stream. He tasted the water from the stream. Fresh, but with a mineral aftertaste. He walked along the stream upstream. An hour later, he found a spot where water was seeping from the bank. Murky, salty. A mineral spring. Weak. But if he collected the water and evaporated it, he could get salt. Coarse, with impurities, but salt nonetheless. He returned. He told Griffin. Griffin said he knew about this spring. His great-great-grandfather used to collect water from there. But then the spring became contaminated by a curse, and everyone abandoned it. Daniel said he'd give it a try. For 3 days, he carried the brackish water in pots. He boiled it down over a fire. He ended up with 2 fistfuls of dirty brown salt. He tasted it. It's bitter, but salty. It'll do. He salted the first piece of meat, a wolf ham. He rubbed it with salt and wrapped it in leaves. He hung it over the fire in a pit he'd dug behind the house. It wasn't a smokehouse. It was a temporary solution, but the smoke did its job. 3 days later, the ham was ready. Tough, dark, with a smoky aftertaste and the bitterness of poor quality salt. In a restaurant, he would have thrown it away without a second thought. Here, it was a treasure. He sliced the ham thinly. He handed out the pieces, a small slice for everyone, a bigger one for old Ben. Ben has joint problems. He needs collagen and fat. Oldie, the widow, gets hers without fat. She has a weak stomach. Annie gets hers finely sliced and soaked in broth. 43 portions, 43 names. He knew each one. In 3 weeks, he'd learned who suffered from what, who needed what, who had bad teeth and who needed their meat boiled rather than smoked, who had children and who needed more fat in their diet. Each portion was more than just meat. Each portion was a prescription for a specific person. Mira watched him do this every day, how he cut it, how he arranged it, how he remembered. She told him that evening that the old Aiden didn't know the names of half the village, that he'd come home and go to bed, didn't speak, didn't look, didn't see. Daniel listened and said nothing. He couldn't tell her the truth, that he wasn't Aiden, that Aiden was gone. That living in this body was a man who had spent 15 years, had been cutting meat in Chicago, and thinking about pancakes for his daughter. He simply said that people change. Mira shook her head. She said that people don't change like that, not overnight, but she didn't ask any more questions. She was afraid of the answer. Daniel began building a real smokehouse in the 4th week. Clay, riverstone. He wasn't a builder, but he knew what a smokehouse should look like because he'd seen them dozens of times, at suppliers' places, on farms, in documentaries. The principle was simple: a chamber for the meat, a firebox at the bottom or on the side, a chimney, and draft control. He drew a plan on the ground with a stick. Griffin looked at it and said they needed some help. He brought 4 men. They worked for 5 days. Clay, stones, wood for the frame. Daniel was in charge. He showed them where to put things. He'd yell when someone placed a stone crooked. Then he'd apologize. Then he'd yell again. Sadie said he was bossing people around like a ship's captain. Daniel replied that he was bossing people around like a head chef, that it was worse. Sadie laughed. The first time under his watch, the smokehouse turned out crooked. The left wall was higher than the right. The chimney didn't draw well. He over-dried the first batch of meat. He smoked the second one too quickly. The third one turned out right. Dense, dark, with a reddish tinge on the inside. The smoke had a cherry flavor from the wild cherry branches he'd found by the stream. The taste. He tasted it himself. He closed his eyes. In Chicago, this would have been just an average job. Here, it was the best thing that had ever happened to this meat in its entire life and afterlife. By the end of the 4th week, Annie was back on her feet. She went out into the yard, thin, unsteady on her feet, but standing, walking. Mira stood in the doorway, holding onto the doorframe, not because she felt sick, but because if she didn't hold on, she'd fall over from what she was seeing. Her daughter was walking across the yard, all by herself. Annie reached the smokehouse. She looked at the smoke. She turned to Daniel and said that she wanted to hold the knife, that she'd be careful. Daniel crouched down in front of her, looked her in the eyes, told her that a knife isn't a toy. A knife is a tool. A toy is that wooden bear over there in the corner, but when she gets older, he'll give her a small knife, his own, and he'll teach her. Annie nodded seriously, like a grown-up. Then she walked back toward the house, staggering a bit, but on her own. Mira watched her, then looked at Daniel, then lowered her head and went inside. That evening, after Annie had fallen asleep, Mira sat down next to Daniel by the smokehouse. He was adding wood chips to the firebox, in silence. Mira said she didn't know who he was, that the Aiden she'd known for 8 years couldn't do any of the things he was doing, that Aiden couldn't talk like that, couldn't look at her like that, couldn't cook at all. Daniel said nothing. Mira said she didn't care who he was, that she wouldn't ask, but she asked him not to leave, just not to leave. Daniel said he wouldn't leave. Mira stood up and went into the house. She turned around at the threshold. She said that the broth he fed Annie every morning was always the same temperature, always, and that she'd noticed. Daniel didn't answer. He sat by the smokehouse and stared at the fire. The broth had to be 55 degrees, not hotter, not colder, so it wouldn't burn the child's throat and so the fat wouldn't solidify. He checked it every morning with his little finger, a reflex from a past life. 15 years in the kitchen teach you things like that. In the 5th week in the village, for the first time in half a year, no one died. Daniel found out about it from Ben. The old man came by in the morning and said that Oldie, the widow, was saying something strange, that her headaches had stopped, that she was sleeping at night, for the first time in 2 years. Daniel nodded. He knew why. Oldie was getting fat-free broth every day. Her stomach couldn't handle fatty foods, but broth made from the skull bone contains glycine. Glycine helps you sleep. Oldie didn't know that. Ben didn't know. No one here knew. The butcher from Chicago knew. He'd spent 15 years reading everything he could find about the properties of meat and bones. In the 6th week, Daniel expanded his hunt. There were no more wolves nearby. The remaining pack had gone deeper into the forest. He needed different prey. He began looking for wild boars. Those damned wild boars were different, more massive than usual, bony growths on their snouts and shoulders. Their tusks curved differently. Their eyes were cloudy. They moved in pairs, not in packs, 2 together, always. Daniel found their tracks by a ravine an hour's walk from the village. Their hooves were wider than usual. The ground was deeply trampled. Heavy beasts, 150 kilograms, maybe 200. He couldn't catch a wild boar the same way he caught a wolf. A pit trap with a rope wouldn't work. A wild boar weighs 3 times as much as a wolf. It would walk right through the rope without even noticing. He needed something else. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. He walked through the forest. He looked at the trees, at the ravine, at the rocks. On the 3rd day, he found a solution. The ravine, narrow, walls up to his waist. If he drove the boar into the ravine, it wouldn't be able to turn around. It wouldn't be able to use its tusks to their full strength. Its sides would be pinned against the walls. Only its head would be free, and its head was covered in bony growths. The boar would charge forward and run into the barricade. Daniel spent 2 days building a barricade at the bottom of the ravine. Rocks, logs, branches, packed tightly, so the boar couldn't break through. On the other side of the barricade, he drove a sharpened stake into the ground, at an angle, at the boar's chest level, not the snout. The snout was covered in the growths. The chest is softer. There's a gap between the plates of bony armor on the chest. The first she-wolf had told him about this. Her stomach contained fragments of boar hair and skin. The wolves hunted young boars. They bit them in the chest, between the growths. So that's the weak spot. A drive hunt. Daniel needed a driver. He asked Tom. Tom turned pale, but agreed. The plan was simple. Tom stands higher up the slope and makes noise. He'd hit the trees with a stick. He'd shout. Wild boars can't stand noise. The boar would run downhill, toward the ravine. Daniel would stand on the edge of the ravine with a cleaver. When the boar ran into the debris and stopped, then. They set out at dawn. They found a couple of wild boars by a mud pit. Large ones. Growths on shoulders 2 fingers thick. Cloudy eyes. One was chewing on roots. The other stood listening to the forest. Tom circled around them from above. Daniel took up a position by the ravine. He waited. Tom started making noise. Strikes on the tree trunk. A shout. The boars raised their heads. The first one turned and ran, not toward the ravine, to the side, to the left. The second one stood still for a second. Then it bolted downhill, toward the ravine. Daniel pressed himself against a tree and held his breath. The boar entered the ravine at full speed. The walls squeezed it from both sides. It couldn't turn. It ran forward. It slammed into the debris. The rocks held. The stake pierced its chest between the growths. Not deep, about 10 centimeters. The boar bellowed. The sound was so loud it made Daniel's ears ring. The beast began to push forward. The stake sank deeper. The boar pushed harder. Blood flowed from its chest. It bellowed and pushed. Daniel stood on the top of the ravine's wall, a machete in his hand. He waited until the beast would weaken. A minute. 2. The boar stopped pushing. It stood in the ravine, wheezing. Blood trickled down the stake onto the ground. Daniel leaped onto the beast's back, knees on its shoulder blades. The machete went in behind the ear, where the base of the skull is, where, in a typical boar, the spinal cord is closest to the surface. 1 blow. The boar fell. Daniel tumbled off it and hit his shoulder against the ravine wall. But the beast lay there, motionless. 200 kilograms of damned meat in a narrow ravine. Daniel sat on a rock nearby, catching his breath. His hands were shaking. Tom ran down from above. He looked down. He saw the boar. He saw Daniel. He asked if he was alive. Daniel said he was alive and that Tom needed to run to the village to get help. He couldn't haul this carcass out alone. Tom ran off. Daniel stayed with the boar, and he began butchering it right there in the ravine. A cleaver, the hide, the first cut. The boar looked different on the inside, not like a wolf. More growths, 7 of them, 2 near the spine, 1 huge one near the liver. The liver around it was dark, almost black. Daniel cut out the growth, taking a wide margin. He removed part of the liver along with it. Better to lose a piece of meat than to leave poison behind. The rest of them was a normal color on the inside when he cut it open. Dark red, firm, good. He sniffed every organ. The kidneys were clean. The heart was large. The boar had 1 heart, just like a normal one, but 1.5 times larger than normal. He made a mental note of it. Tom returned with 4 men. They spent 2 hours hauling the carcass out, using ropes along the ravine walls, dragging it along the ground. It was heavy. Daniel walked alongside them, carrying the separately excised growths in a bag. He carried them carefully. He didn't want them to break or burst. He needed to study them. They returned to the village around noon. Daniel butchered the boar in the clearing in front of the smokehouse, in front of everyone. 43 people stood around watching. He worked for 3 hours, methodically, quietly. Sometimes he told Tom and Sadie what he was doing and why. Here's the ham. We're removing it from the bone. The knife goes along the femur, not across it. Here's the shoulder blade. The tendon is thick here. We cut at the base. Here are the ribs. Run the knife between the 3rd and 4th ribs and they'll separate on their own. Sadie stood nearby, memorizing every detail. Her eyes followed his every movement. She moved her lips, repeating his words. Tom took notes with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of bark. The writing was crooked, but he was writing. From a 200-kilogram wild boar, Daniel got 110 kilograms of lean meat. The bones were for broth. The fat was for rendering. He saved the hide. The hide of that damned boar was thicker than usual. The growths on it were like plates. If he cut them off and tanned the hide properly, it would be tougher than any village-made leather. But that was for later. Right now, it was all about the meat. He salted the hams, 4 of them, 8 kilograms each. He smoked the ribs with a quick, hot smoke. He cut the shoulder blades into portions. He handed them out. He prepared the livers separately, for Mira, thinly sliced, with wild garlic and rowan berries. For Annie, braised meat, tender. He simmered it for a long time over a low, so the fibers would break down and the child could chew it effortlessly. That evening, a man Daniel had never seen before came to see him. A young man, about 30 years old, sturdy. His hands were large and rough. He said his name was Dex, that he was a blacksmith. He lived in Redfield, a 2-day journey away. He'd heard there was meat in Hollowend, real meat. He offered to work, to forge whatever was needed in exchange for food. Daniel looked at his hands. A blacksmith's hands. Calluses on his right fingers. Burns on his left forearm. The real deal. He asked if Dex could forge a butcher's knife. Straight, long, with a thin blade and a full tang handle. Dex said he could if he had the iron. Daniel showed him the boar's bone spurs. Solid. Heavy. He asked if they could be remelted or used somehow. Dex took a growth, turned it over in his hands, tapped it, said it wasn't bone, not exactly, denser, heavier, kinda strange, but if heated, something might come of it. Daniel nodded. He said there was also a hide, a thick one. If Dex could make knives, the hide could be used to make sheaths and a cutting apron. Dex stayed. He settled into one of the empty houses. Daniel gave him meat for 3 days, smoked wild boar belly. Dex ate and couldn't stop. He hadn't eaten meat in 2 months. He'd been living on porridge and roots. The first blacksmith. The first person to come to Hollowend and not leave it. Griffin stood off to the side and watched it all. At the smokehouse, from which smoke was rising. At the meat hanging on ropes. At the blacksmith, who was eating the smoked pork belly and crying. At Daniel, who was standing by the cutting table, sharpening his cleaver. Griffin walked over to him. He said that in 5 years, 257 people had left the village. Some had died, some had run away, some had simply vanished. For the first time, someone had arrived. For the first time. Daniel said more would come. If there's food, people come. That's the only law that works everywhere, all the time. Dex built the forge in 3 days. Stones from the creek, clay to hold it together. Bellows made from boar hide that Daniel had tanned the rough way. He soaked it in the creek, scraped off the flesh, rubbed it with the animal's brain. Brain is the best tanning agent for raw hide. Every butcher who worked with farmer suppliers in the Chicago suburbs. Here, that knowledge didn't exist. Dex tried to melt the bony growth on the 3rd day. He heated the bellows until they were red hot. He placed the growth on a stone. The growth didn't melt, but it changed. At high temperatures, it became malleable, like very thick resin. It could be shaped. Dex flattened a piece with a hammer. He let it cool. The result was a plate, thin, dense, dark gray with a greenish tinge. Dex tried to scratch it with a knife. The knife slipped and left no mark. He looked at Daniel. He said that this material was harder than iron. Daniel picked up the plate. He turned it over in his hands. Lightweight for its strength. Smooth. He tapped it with his fingernail. The sound was dull, not metallic. Something between bone and stone. He asked Dex if he could make blade guards out of it. Dex said he'd try. He needed more growths. He needed charcoal. He needed time. Daniel nodded and went into the forest. By the end of the 6th week, he had enough antlers from 5 animals he'd butchered: 2 wolves, 2 boars, and a deer. The first deer he'd ever hunted here. He hadn't killed the deer, he'd found it dead. The damned deer, with extra ribs under its hide, was lying by the watering hole. It died on its own. Physical exhaustion. The distortion had eaten it up from the inside. The growths were enormous, 9 of them. One, the size of 2 fists, had fused with the spine. Daniel spent 4 hours butchering it because working around the growths was like defusing a bomb. Every cut had to be precise. The knife followed the border between healthy tissue and the growth. A millimeter of error and the growth would burst. The fluid inside the growth was black and smelled of that same sour metallic odor. Daniel didn't know what would happen if the fluid got on the meat. He didn't want to find out. He salvaged a little from the deer. Most of the carcass was too deeply affected, but the ribs were clean, the tongue was clean, and most importantly, the deer hide. Even that damned one, with the bumps from the extra ribs on the inside. A deer hide is thinner than a boar's, softer. If tanned properly, it can be used for sewing, clothing, bags, belts. Daniel brought the hide to the village and gave it to Mira. He told her she needed to soak it, then scrape it, then rub it with brain matter. Mira looked at the hide, then at Daniel. She asked how he knew how to tan leather. Daniel said he just knew, and that was that. Mira didn't ask where he'd learned it. She'd already gotten used to the fact that this man knew things he shouldn't know. She soaked the hide in the stream. The next day, she scraped it. On the 3rd day, she rubbed it with brain matter. Her hands were elbow deep in fat and flesh. She worked silently and with intense focus. Daniel saw in her something he'd seen before in the best workers at the restaurant: precision, patience, a willingness to do the dirty work right. Mira wasn't weak. Mira was a person who had been weighed down by grief and hunger for 5 years. Take away the grief and hunger, and underneath stands a woman with a backbone of steel. By the 7th week, Annie was running. Not fast, not far, but she was running. Every morning she would come to the smokehouse and sit on a log next to Daniel. She watched him work. She asked questions. Why is meat red? Why is bone white? Why does the smoke smell sweet, but the meat tastes salty? Daniel answered every question. Seriously, like a grown-up. Meat is red because it contains iron. Blood carries iron to the muscles, and that's why the muscles are red. Bones are white because they contain calcium. Calcium is white. The smoke smells sweet because there's sugar in the wood. When wood burns slowly, the sugar comes out with the smoke. Annie listened with her mouth agape. Then she retold it to Myra, confusingly, with her own additions. Myra listened and didn't interrupt. Every night before bed, Annie asked Daniel to tell a story. Not a fairy tale. A story. How he outwitted the boar. How he found the she-wolf. How he simmered broth all night long. Daniel told the stories, in a quiet voice, without embellishment, just as it was. Annie would fall asleep halfway through, and he would cover her with a pelt and sit beside her until her breathing became steady. At the beginning of the 7th week, what Daniel had been waiting for and dreading happened. A wagon appeared on the road to Hollow End. Just one, pulled by a horse, covered with canvas. A man of about 45 sat on the box. He was heavyset, wearing a nice jacket with a chain on his vest. Next to him sat a girl of about 26, blonde-haired, wearing a leather jacket with 2 fanny packs. The man stopped the wagon at the house on the far end. He got out, looked around, saw smoke coming from the smokehouse, sniffed the air, and followed the scent. It was Talbot, a buyer from Greyhaven, a town 2 days' journey away. He traded in meat, leather, salt, anything that could be bought or sold. His assistant was walking beside him, Haley Marks. Daniel was standing by the smokehouse when they approached. Talbot stopped 3 steps away. He was looking at the hams hanging from the crossbar above the smoke, 4 of them, dark, firm, smelling of cherry smoke and salt. Talbot said he'd heard a story, that in Hollow End someone was eating the cursed beasts and not dying, that he'd driven for 2 days to see this nonsense with his own eyes. Daniel didn't answer. He took 1 ham off the crossbar, placed it on the cutting board, cut off a thin slice, placed it on a clean burdock leaf, held it out to Talbot. Talbot looked at the slice, at Daniel, at the ham. He took it, sniffed it, put it in his mouth, chewed slowly. His eyes shifted. First wariness, then surprise, then something like greed. He swallowed, waited. Nothing happened. His stomach didn't cramp. His head didn't spin. He was alive, and the meat was delicious. Talbot said he wanted to talk business. Haley stood nearby, looking not at the meat, but at Daniel, at his hands, at the way he held the knife, at the way he cut. She'd seen many butchers, This one was different. Daniel said they could talk, but first, Talbot would eat a proper meal. He'd prepared dinner, not to impress, for the conversation. Braised wild boar shoulder, slow cooked, 6 hours over the coals. The meat practically fell apart just looking at it, with wild onions, with mushrooms that Annie had picked by the stream under his supervision, with salt from a mineral spring. Talbot ate and said nothing. Haley ate and remained silent as well. When the plates were empty, Talbot leaned back. He looked at Daniel and began to rattle off numbers. He could sell smoked meat in Greyhaven, 1 coin per pound. Pork cost 3/4 of a coin. Beef, 1.25 coins. A smoked ham from that damned beast has no price because it doesn't exist on the market. But if it tastes like good game, and it does, then it can be sold for a high price, very dearly. Daniel listened. Then he said he didn't need coins. He needed salt, flour, iron, and a good hunting knife. Talbot tilted his head. 10 smoked hams for salt, flour, iron, a knife. Daniel said 15 pounds of salt, 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of iron in strips, and not just any knife, but one with a full tang and a blade as long as a palm. Talbot grunted. He said that was expensive. Daniel said he had no one else to buy from. Talbot thought it over. He agreed. They shook hands. Talbot left that same day. He promised to return in 2 weeks with the goods. Haley stayed behind. She stood by the smokehouse and watched the smoke. Then she looked at Daniel. She asked how long he'd been doing this. Daniel said his whole life. Haley shook her head. She said she'd seen butchers in Greyhaven. They chop meat with an axe and sell it in pieces. What Daniel does isn't butchering. It's something else. She doesn't know the word for it. Daniel said there is a word. Craft. Haley looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and walked toward the van. Halfway there, she turned around and said she'd come back with Talbot. That's interesting, she said. The van drove off. Daniel stood on the road and watched it go. Sadie stood next to him. She asked who that blonde woman with the bags was. Daniel said she was Money. Sadie didn't understand. Daniel explained. Talbot is the mouth that eats. Haley is the head that counts. Talbot will buy 10 hams and sell them. Haley will figure out how many they can buy next time. In 6 months, she'll know the price of every cut of meat within a 100-mile radius. And by then, it won't be Daniel who needs Talbot, but Talbot who needs Daniel. Sadie looked at him. She said he was thinking like a merchant, not a butcher. Daniel replied that a good butcher always thinks like a merchant. Otherwise, he's a bad butcher. That evening, Mira asked why he'd given away 10 hams. That's a month's worth of food for the whole village. Daniel said that 10 hams aren't food. 10 hams equal 15 pounds of salt. With 15 pounds of salt, he can smoke 50 hams. 50 hams mean 2 winters for Hollow End. Mira was silent for a moment. Then she said she'd never thought of it that way. Daniel said that was normal, that when you're struggling every day to survive, you don't have time to think beyond tomorrow. But now you can. Now there's meat, there's smoke, there's salt, and you can think a week ahead, then a month, then a year. Mira looked at him, and there was something new in her eyes. Not fear, not gratitude, something warm and quiet that she herself couldn't yet name. That night, for the first time, she lay down next to him. She didn't snuggle up, she didn't hug him, she just lay down beside him, a palm's width away. Daniel lay there, staring at the ceiling. He felt the warmth of her body. He didn't move, he didn't speak. Somewhere behind the wall, Annie was sleeping. Outside the window, the forest rustled. That very same forest that 2 months ago had seemed like a death sentence. Now it was their provider. Cursed, sick, dangerous, but a provider nonetheless. And in that forest, where somewhere deep within lay the bones of the priest Orvin, and the forest knew that Daniel would come for them. Not now, not soon, but he would come, because every precise cut he made untied a knot. Every gland of distortion he excised was 1 thread out of 1,000, and the forest sensed the curse's grip weakening, 1 knot at a time. Daniel didn't know that. He was just doing his job, just as he had done for 15 years in Chicago. Carefully, precisely, with respect for every carcass. And he fell asleep thinking not about the curse, but about how tomorrow he'd have to check the smokehouse, add some wood chips, and make Annie some broth. The temperature was 55 degrees, as always. Talbot returned in 12 days, not 14, as he promised, earlier. The van was heavier than last time. Haley was sitting on the running boards next to him. She jumped down first. She looked around. She saw the smokehouse. She saw smoke. She saw Sadie standing at the cutting table with a knife, skinning a wild boar leg. Haley walked over to Daniel. She said that Talbot had sold all 10 legs in 4 days. Not in a week, not in 2, in 4 days. People in Greyhaven were lining up. Meat from that damned beast. Smoked, clean, safe. Nothing like it had ever been seen before. The price had tripled by the time the last leg was sold. Talbot climbed down from the wagon and began unloading. 15 pounds of salt in a sack, 20 pounds of flour, 10 pounds of iron in strips, and a knife. Daniel took the knife. He pulled it from its sheath. The blade was as long as his palm. Good steel, not excellent, but good. The handle fit perfectly in his hand. The balance was decent. He ran his thumb along the edge. Sharp, not perfect, but it would do the job. The first decent tool in 2 months. Talbot said he wanted more. 20 hams next time. And not just hams, ribs, brisket, tongue if there was any. No one in Greyhaven has ever tasted the smoked tongue of that damned beast. It'll be a sensation. Daniel said that 20 hind legs meant 4 boars. 4 boars meant at least 3 weeks of hunting.
He couldn't guarantee it. Talbot grimaced. Haley said she could wait. That rushing the butcher spoils the meat. Daniel looked at her. She understood without explanation. Talbot didn't get it. Talbot was thinking about money. Haley was thinking about the process. Daniel suggested something else. Not 20 legs, 10 legs, and 10 smoked tongues. A tongue weighs less. It smokes faster. It'll cost more because it's a rarity. And one more thing. Hot smoked rib plates. A quick product. 2 days instead of a week. You can sell it as street food. In Chicago, smoked ribs on the street cost $12 a serving. Here, the analogy is different, but the principle is the same. Fast, tasty, on the go. Talbot listened with a growing gleam in his eyes. Haley listened with growing respect. They shook hands. This time, the terms were different. In exchange for 10 ham hocks, 10 tongues, and 20 servings of ribs, Daniel asked for salt, a lot of it. 30 pounds. Rope. 100 meters of good hemp rope. Fabric. Canvas for clothes. And 4 chickens. Alive. Talbot choked on the word chickens. He asked why. Daniel said the chickens lay eggs. Eggs are protein for the children. In Hollow End, there are 3 children besides Annie. They need eggs. Talbot agreed. Deal. Haley stayed in the village for 2 days. She followed Daniel around and watched, silently. She wrote something down in a little notebook. She watched how he smoked the meat, how he cut it, how he chose the wood chips for the smoke. On the evening of the first day, she sat down next to him by the smokehouse. She asked why he didn't haggle harder. Meat is worth more, much more. He could ask for 3 times as much. Daniel said he could, but he wouldn't, because Talbot needed to earn enough to make the trip back. If he took all his profit, Talbot would find another supplier or stop making the trip. But if he let him make a good profit, he'd bring more, and he'd tell others, and others would come. Haley looked at him. She said that no farmer she knew thought that way. Daniel replied that he wasn't a farmer. Haley asked who he was then. Daniel paused. He said he was a butcher, just a butcher. On the second day, Haley asked him to show her how he cuts out the distortion nodes. Daniel led her to a table where a fresh wolf carcass lay. He slit open the belly. He showed her the growths. Black and green. Dense. Haley leaned in. She sniffed. She recoiled. She said it smelled like metal and rot. Daniel nodded. He began cutting. He demonstrated each step. Here's the boundary between healthy tissue and the growth. See? The color changes. It's darker. Tougher. The knife follows this line. Not deeper, not shallower. Exactly along the line. If you cut into the growth, the fluid will seep into the meat, and the meat will become poisonous. Haley watched, holding her breath. Then she said quietly that it was the scariest and most beautiful thing she'd ever seen in her life. Daniel didn't answer. He finished cutting out the 3 growths and set them aside. The meat around them was clean, red, healthy. Haley touched it with her finger. Ordinary meat, no different from uncursed meat. She left with Talbot on the 3rd day. Before leaving, she went up to Daniel. She said she had a proposal. She wanted to sell his meat separately from Talbot's, under her own name. Daniel looked at her. He asked why she wanted to do that. She already had a business with Talbot. Haley said that Talbot traded for money. She wanted to trade for the sake of her name. She had a name, Marks. Her father had gambled away the Marks trading house 7 years ago. Ever since then, she's been rebuilding her reputation 1 piece at a time. If she becomes the only merchant selling pure meat from the cursed beasts, the name Marks will mean something again. Daniel was silent. He didn't see a merchant standing before him. He saw a person with a specific kind of pain, like Annie with her fever, like Myra with her anemia. Only the pain was different, not in the body,
but in the name, and he had an answer to that pain. He went into the smokehouse, brought out 5 smoked tongues, the best ones, the finest, wrapped them in clean canvas, tied them with twine, said this wasn't Talbot's shipment, it was Haley Marks's shipment from Hollow End, the first batch bearing her mark. Haley took the bundle. She stood there. She looked at him. Then she turned silently and walked to the wagon. She got inside, she closed the curtain, and she didn't come out for a long time. Talbot asked what was wrong with her. Daniel said everything was fine. The wagon drove away. Daniel went back to work. 3 days after Talbot left, a woman arrived in the village. Alone, on foot, dark hair, quiet eyes, tattoos on her wrists, drawings of plants, delicate, faded. She stopped by the well and asked for water. Ben gave her water. He asked who she was. She said her name was Lyra Van, that she was from Turnmore, a village a day's journey to the west. She said she'd heard about a man who heals with food. Ben took her to Daniel. Daniel was standing at the cutting table, trimming the membrane off a wild boar leg. Lyra stopped 5 steps away. She watched his hands, silently, for a minute, 2. Then she said she could tell he knew anatomy, that few people cut so cleanly along the fascia. Daniel stopped. He looked at her. He asked how she knew the word fascia. Lyra replied that she was a herbalist, that her mother had been a herbalist before her, that her mother knew the human body from the inside better than any doctor within a 3-day journey, that her mother had been burned at the stake for it. Daniel put down his knife. He wiped his hands. He looked at Lyra intently. He asked what she used to treat people. Lyra said herbs, oak bark for inflammation, a yellow root for fever, moss from the north side of the rock for wounds, yarrow for bleeding. Daniel listened. Then he said he wanted to show her something. He led her to the house. He showed her a small pot of pâté that he made for Myra every morning. Boar liver, wild garlic, rowan berries, pureed, mixed with fat. He said this was his remedy for anemia. The liver provides iron. Garlic helps the body absorb the iron. Rowan berries add acid, which prevents the iron from leaving the body too quickly. Lyra listened with wide eyes. Then she said that was all true. Her mother used to make something similar, but with herbs. No meat, less effective, because iron from herbs is absorbed less efficiently than from liver. She knew that. Her mother knew that. But no one ate the meat of those accursed beasts. There was no meat. Daniel said one word. Teach. Lyra froze. No one had ever said that word to her. People came to her for medicine. They took it, they left. No one had ever asked her to teach them, especially not a man, especially not a butcher. She sat down across from him, and for 3 hours they talked. He told her what he knew about meat and bones. She told him what she knew about herbs and roots. He wrote it down with a charcoal stick on a piece of bark. She memorized it without taking notes. By evening, they had compiled the list. 12 herbs that grow within an hour's walk of the village, each with a specific use. Oak bark plus bone broth for sore joints. Yarrow plus kidney fat for healing wounds. A yellow root plus liver pâté for fever. Each recipe isn't just a herb or just meat. Each recipe is a precise combination, just like in the kitchen. Ingredient A works. Ingredient B works. Together, they work 3 times as well. Lyra stayed in the village. Griffin gave her an empty house. Daniel gave her enough meat to last a week. She started working the next morning. She gathered herbs, she dried them, she ground them, she mixed them with what Daniel had given her, bone marrow, brain extract, liver paste. After a week, Ben's knees stopped hurting. After 2 weeks, Oldie the widow ventured beyond the well for the first time in a year. She had the strength to walk to the stream. Lyra and Daniel worked side by side, in silence, each at their own table. Sometimes he'd pass her a piece of liver without saying a word. She would take it. Sometimes she would place a bunch of herbs on his table and leave. He would take it. They understood each other without explanation. 2 people who work with what others throw away. Offal and weeds, trash and waste. In their hands, trash became medicine. By the end of the 8th week, Daniel stood by the smokehouse one evening and counted. Enough meat to last 4 weeks. Enough salt for 2 months. Flour for a month. A blacksmith, an herbalist, 2 apprentices, a trade route, 4 chickens that Talbot would bring. For the first time since waking up in a stranger's body, he thought not about tomorrow, but about next month. And next month didn't look like a struggle for survival. It looked like life. Rumors reached Lord Bren in the 9th week. Daniel learned about this from Haley. She arrived without Talbot. alone, on horseback, exhausted. Haley jumped down and said the news was bad. In Greyhaven, they're talking about Hollowend. They're talking a lot. Meat from cursed beasts that doesn't kill. A village that came back to life. A butcher who does the impossible. These rumors had reached Lord Bren's garrison, and the captain of the Order of the Drivers, Sir Rowene Ask, had started asking questions. Daniel stood by the cutting table and listened.
He didn't interrupt. When Haley finished, he asked when to expect him. Haley said she didn't know. Maybe a week, maybe 2. Ravain isn't the type to rush things. He gathers information first. Then he arrives. Daniel nodded. He asked what she knew about Ravain. Haley knew a little. 40 years old, a nobleman, captain of the Order of the Hunters for the past 12 years, an impeccable reputation. He considers hunting a sacred right of blood. As a matter of principle, he doesn't let commoners into the forest. 10 years ago, his younger brother was killed on a hunt by a cursed boar. Since then, Ravain has banned the hunting of cursed beasts for everyone except the Order. Formally, for safety's sake. In reality, for control. Daniel listened. Then he asked Haley what Ravain really wanted. Haley thought for a moment. She said that Ravain wanted order. His world is simple. Nobles hunt, peasants till the soil. Everyone in their place. A butcher who kills cursed beasts better than knights isn't just breaking the law, it's disrupting the natural order. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said he understood, and that Rowayne would get his dinner. Haley didn't understand. Daniel didn't bother to explain. He began to prepare, not for battle, but for dinner. For the next 10 days, Daniel worked in 2 shifts, hunting in the morning, cooking in the evening. He killed 2 more boars that week. Both were herded into the ravine through the corral. The method worked. He'd perfected it. Now the stakes were set at 3 angles. No matter which way the boar entered the barrier, one of the stakes would strike a vulnerable spot. Tom helped with the corral. Sadie started going out with them. She stood on the edge of the ravine with a spare spear, just in case the boar broke free. So far, it hadn't been necessary. Daniel was smoking the meat, curing it, salting it, preparing provisions. But most importantly, he was preparing one specific dish for one specific person. Sir Rowene Ask, captain, nobleman, a man who had lost his brother. Daniel didn't know how to cook for a nobleman in this world, but he knew how to cook for a man in pain, and Rowan was a man in pain. His brother had been killed by a boar, and Rowan had sealed off that pain with prohibitions and rules. Just as a cook covers a burn with a bandage and keeps working, the pain doesn't go away, it just ceases to be visible. Daniel chose the boar, the very beast that had killed knights, the cursed one, with bony growths, with cloudy eyes, with fangs curved like sickles. He butchered it perfectly. Every growth was cut away without a single drop of black liquid. The meat was clean. He selected the shoulder blade, the best cut, meat on the bone, marbled with fat, with long, tender fibers. He marinated in its own juices with wild juniper and mountain ash bark. 2 days. Then he smoked it, slowly, over cherry wood chips, low temperature, 6 hours. The meat turned out dark pink on the inside, with a subtle, smoky aroma, with a hint of juniper that gives way to a touch of bitterness. He tasted it. He closed his eyes. In Chicago, this would make it onto a restaurant menu without a doubt. Here, it was a weapon. Rowayne arrived on the 12th day. Daniel saw him from a distance. 4 horsemen on the road to the village. Ahead front was a man in a dark green cloak, straight back, broad shoulders, a sword in a plain scabbard at his belt. Behind him were 3 soldiers in leather armor with Lord Bren's coat of arms on their breastplates. The village fell silent. Griffin stepped out to meet them. Daniel stood by the smokehouse and didn't move. Rowayne dismounted. He was taller than Daniel had expected, gray at the temples, a stern face, gray, watchful eyes. He surveyed the village with a single, slow glance. The smokehouse. Smoke. Meat hanging on ropes. A cutting table with knives. The blacksmith's horn. Then he looked at Daniel. He said he was Sir Rowayne Ask, captain of Lord Cassius Bren's Order of the Hunters, that he had come to find out if it was true that in this abandoned village, people were hunting the cursed beasts without the Order's permission. Daniel nodded. He said it was true. Rowayne was silent for a moment. He had expected a denial, or fear, or excuses. The butcher gave him none of that. He simply nodded. It was true. Rowan said that hunting cursed beasts was forbidden for commoners by Lord Bren's decree. That violation was punishable by confiscation of property and 20 lashes. Daniel listened. Then he said he knew, and that before Sir Rowan decided what to do, he asked him to sit down at the table. Rowan looked at him for a long time. Then he said this wasn't a dinner party. This is an interrogation. Daniel replied that even during an interrogation, a man could eat, and that Sir Rowan had been riding for 2 days, and that the meat was already ready.
Rowan hesitated. His soldiers stood behind him. Griffin stood to the side, white as a sheet. Sadie clenched her fists. Lyra watched from the window of her house. Rowan sat down, at the table under the canopy that Daniel had built last week. A simple table, planks on trestles, but clean. Daniel brought out the dish, smoked wild boar shoulder on the bone, sliced thinly, arranged on a wooden board. Next to it, a handful of wild berries and mint leaves. Simple, no frills. Rovain looked at the meat. He asked if this was the cursed beast. Daniel said yes, a boar, cursed, with bony growths, killed 2 weeks ago, butchered by him personally. All the knots of distortion had been cut out. The meat was clean. Rovain didn't move. He stared at the thin slices of meat, his face set. Daniel sat down across from him. He said that 10 years ago, his brother had been killed by such a beast. Rovain looked up. There was something sharp and dangerous in his eyes. Daniel continued. He said his brother hadn't died because he was weak or cowardly. His brother had died because no one knew how. No one knew where the beast's weak spot was. No one knew that the poison was in specific glands and not in the meat. No one knew that there was a slit between the growths on its chest where a spear could be thrust. Now they know. And he asked Rovain to eat. Rovain sat motionless. The soldiers behind him exchanged glances. Then Rovain slowly picked up a chunk of meat. He put it in his mouth. He chewed. For a long time. His eyes closed for a second. The meat was good. He knew the taste of game. He'd been hunting for 30 years. He'd eaten venison and wild boar prepared by Lord Bren's finest chefs. This meat was just as good. Maybe even better. Smoky, tender, with a hint of juniper bitterness. And this was the boar that had killed his brother. That very beast. Cursed. Dangerous. Impossible. And there it was, lay on the cutting board, thinly sliced. Safe. Delicious. Rovain ate in silence. No one spoke. The whole village was watching. He ate 4 slices. He rested his hands on the table. He looked at Daniel. Then he stood up. He said he would return in a month, that the hunt would continue until his return, that he would report to Lord Bren personally. He mounted his horse and rode away. Without a whip, without confiscation, without a single word of threat. Griffin stood by the road and watched him go. Then he turned to Daniel. He asked what that had been. Daniel said it had been lunch. Griffin shook his head. He said it hadn't been lunch. It had been a duel, and Daniel had won it. Daniel didn't answer. He was clearing the table. A month later, a package arrived from Rovain. No letter, no messenger. Just a bundle tied to a post by the road at dawn. Inside was a knife, a hunting knife, an old one. The blade had a chip from bone. The handle was wrapped in leather, worn smooth from thousands of hours in a hand. On the pommel was the Askov coat of arms. It was Rovain's personal knife, not a gift, a confession. Daniel took the knife. He examined it. The balance was perfect. The steel was well seasoned. You could work with this knife. He hung it on his belt next to his cleaver. 2 knives, one rough for heavy work, the other precise for clean work. Just like in a restaurant, a chef's knife and a boning knife. Sadie asked what kind of knife it was. Daniel showed her the coat of arms. Sadie whistled. She said that if the captain of the Order of the Herders was sending his knife to a butcher, then the world had turned upside down. Daniel replied that the world hadn't turned upside down. It was simply that one man had acknowledged that another knew more than he did. That wasn't an upheaval. It was a beginning. Fall was coming to an end. The air had grown crisp in the mornings. The puddles by the stream were covered with a thin layer of ice by dawn. There was a month left until winter, maybe less. Daniel stood by the smokehouse at dawn and counted the supplies. 24 smoked hams, 18 bundles of jerky ribs, 10 smoked tongues, 40 pounds of salt. The flour was gone. The chickens Talbot had brought laid eggs every other day. 4 chickens, 2 eggs a day. For 43 people, that's nothing. But for 3 children and 2 sick old people, that's all there is. Mira distributed the eggs every morning. She did it silently and precisely, just as Daniel distributed the meat. She had learned this from him. Not because he taught her, because she watched. Annie got an egg every morning, beaten with a drop of broth. She called it a pie. Daniel didn't correct her. Let it be a pie. Dex had finished his first knife a week earlier. Not made of iron, made of bone spurs. The material was strange. It didn't forge like metal. It was shaped when heated, just like, but hardened to a strength greater than steel. Dex crafted the blade by trial and error. 6 attempts. The first 5 cracked as they cooled. The 6th worked. The blade was as long as his palm, dark gray with a greenish tinge. It didn't shine. It didn't rust. The edge was thin. Daniel put on a wild boar's leg. The knife sliced through the meat like butter, effortlessly. He cut along the bone, and the blade didn't dull. It didn't slip. It held the angle perfectly. Daniel stopped. He looked at the knife, then at Dex. He said it was the best carving knife he'd ever held. Dex smirked. He said the material does half the work. He'd simply shaped it. Daniel shook his head. He said that material without a craftsman is just a stone, and a craftsman without material is a dreamer. Together, they make the knife. Dex said nothing, but it was clear he was pleased. Daniel began preparing for the main hunt. The gray one. That damned bear, as big as a wagon. 10 years deep in the forest. It had killed 8 gamekeepers. It had killed Aiden Court. It had killed who knows how many others. It was the master of the forest, and it stood between the village and winter. Not literally. The bear didn't attack the village, but it controlled the territory. Beyond the third ravine lay its domain, and beyond the third ravine roamed the deer. Large ones. A herd of 20. Enough meat to last the whole winter. But the deer lived under the gray bear's protection. Not by agreement, out of fear. Nothing hunted on the bear's territory. Not wolves, nor any other predators. The deer knew this and stayed close by. To reach the deer, one had to pass through Gray's territory. Daniel had no intention of killing the bear in a head-on attack. He wasn't the hero. He was a butcher. Butchers don't fight bears. Butchers prepare. For 3 days, he walked to the edge of Gray's territory, studying. Tracks. Huge. Each paw print the size of Daniel's head. Deep. A heavy beast. 300 kilograms, maybe 400. Droppings. Daniel found some old bear droppings and studied them as if they were his thesis. Bone fragments, fur, berries, fish scales. The bear ate everything. An omnivore, just like any other bear. But there was different. The droppings contained fragments of bony growths, its own. The bear shed the growths. They flaked off its body, and it swallowed them. This meant that the distortion within the bear wasn't stable. It built up and fell off in cycles, like molting. Daniel thought about this for 2 days. If the bear sheds the growths, then there must be a moment when its armor is thinner, when the old growths have fallen off and the new ones haven't grown back yet, a window of vulnerability. But how could they tell when that window was open? The answer came from Lyra. Daniel told her about the droppings and the growths. Lyra listened. Then she said that animals' molting cycles are tied to the moon. The autumn full moon is in 12 days. If the bear molts like other animals, then by the full moon, the growths will be at their thinnest. Daniel looked at her. He said she was a genius. Lyra shook her head. She said she wasn't a genius. She just listened to the forest, like her mother. Daniel began to set a trap, not a pit. A pit wouldn't hold a 400-kilogram animal, not a barricade. A bear would walk through a barricade as if it were paper. He needed something else. He found a spot, a narrow passage between 2 cliffs at the edge of Sedoy's territory. The cliffs were high, 3 meters, and smooth. The bear wouldn't be able to climb over them. Between them was a gap 2 steps wide. The bear would fit through, but with difficulty. Its sides would be pressed against the rock. It wouldn't be able to turn around. Daniel examined the rocks. He found a crack in the one on the left. He drove a wooden wedge into it. He could place a log on top of the wedge. The log would fall when the bear passed by. It would fall on its back. It won't kill him, but it will hold him up. It'll pin him to the ground for a few seconds. And in those seconds, he'll need to hit the weak spot. He remembered the she-wolf, his first kill here. A wolf's weak spot is behind the shoulder blade. On a wild boar, it's between the growths on the chest. As for a bear, he didn't know. He'd never butchered a bear here, only in Chicago. Ordinary black bears. On an ordinary bear, the weak spot is under the left shoulder blade. That's where the heart is closest to the surface. But Sedoy had growths. They might cover that spot, or they might not. He didn't know. And that was the scariest part. Going after an animal he'd never butchered before, without a map, without knowledge of anatomy, by feel. Daniel prepared the bait. From Sedoy's droppings, he extracted fragments of the growths. He soaked them. He mixed them with fish he'd caught in the stream and with bone marrow. The smell was so bad that Sadie backed away 10 steps and said it was the worst thing she'd ever smelled in her life. Daniel said that to a bear, it was perfume. He laid out the bait along the trail leading to the pass between the rocks, 12 pieces every 20 steps. The bear would go from piece to piece, toward the pass, toward the log, toward the spot. Now it was time to wait. 12 days until the full moon. Daniel waited and prepared. Every day he sharpened his knives, the cleaver, Rovein's knife, and the knife made from bone spurs. Every day he checked the trap, tightened the log, and inspected the wedge. Every evening he cooked broth for Annie, pâté for Myra, and an ointment made from fat and yarrow for Ben. Every morning he went to the smokehouse and worked. Village life didn't stop just because the butcher was preparing for a bear hunt. People ate, children grew, decks forged, Lyra healed. Sadie taught Tom what she'd learned from Daniel. Life went on. 3 days before the full moon, Myra came to him that evening. Annie was asleep. The house was warm from the hearth. Myra sat down beside him. She was silent for a minute. Then she said she knew where he was going, that Ben had told her about the Gray One, that everyone in the village knew. Daniel didn't deny it. Myra said that the old Aiden had gone into the woods and never returned, that the Gray One had killed him, that she'd spent a week alone with her sick daughter, thinking her husband was dead. And he was dead. She said this in an even voice, no tears, no trembling, just a statement of fact. Then she said that if this Aiden didn't come back either, she wouldn't be able to bear it a second time. Daniel was silent. Then he said he'd come back. Myra said the old Aiden used to say that too. Daniel looked her in the eyes. He said he wasn't the same as before, that he'd spent 15 years working with carcasses and knew where a beast's heart was, that he wouldn't go after a bear with his bare hands, that he had a plan, that the plan works, that the only thing he can't promise is that the plan will go perfectly, but he promises he won't get into a fight. He's a butcher, not a soldier. Mira looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up. She walked over to the cot where Annie had been sleeping. She picked up the little wooden bear figurine that Ben had carved for the girl. She came back. She placed the figurine in Daniel's hand. She told him to return it to Annie in person. Daniel clutched the figurine, a little wooden bear in the butcher's palm. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He'd be leaving in the morning. He'll be back in 3 days. Or maybe not. But he knew the answer. He'll be back, because there's a wooden bear in his pocket. And at home, a real child is waiting for dinner. Daniel left the house before dawn, a cleaver on his belt, Rovein's knife, a knife made from a bone growth, a rope, a torch, a bag of bait, a wooden bear in his pocket. He was going alone. Tom begged to go with him. Sadie demanded it. Griffin offered. Daniel turned them all down. He said that on this hunt, 1 extra person meant 1 extra casualty. A bear isn't a wild boar. A wild boar runs from noise. A bear heads toward the noise. If anyone else were with Daniel, the bear would have a choice of who to kill first. It's better not to have that choice. The forest greeted him with silence. Not the usual silence, a deathly silence. No birds, no insects, no wind in the treetops. It was as if the forest had held its breath. Daniel walked for 2 hours to the third ravine, the edge of Sadoy's territory. Here he stopped. He opened the bag and began laying out the bait, piece by piece, from the start of the trail to the rocky pass. The smell was monstrous. Fish, bone marrow, and ground-up growths. But for the bear, it was a call. Something of its own, something familiar. Daniel laid out 12 pieces and stepped back toward the rocks. He checked the trap. A log on a wedge, a rope tied to the wedge. The other end of the rope ran behind the left rock. There was a ledge there. That's where he would stand. When the bear enters the passage, Daniel will yank the rope. The wedge will come loose. The log will fall. The bear will be pinned for a few seconds. And then the knife. Where? He didn't know exactly. The left shoulder blade. If the growths really are thinner during a full moon, the knife will pass through the bony growth. If not, he didn't think about that. You can't think about failure before a hunt. It's a rule from the kitchen. Before a big service, don't think about what could go wrong. Think about what needs to be done, step by step. He climbed up onto the ledge, crouched down, the rope in his left hand, the bone-handled knife in his right, the cleaver on his belt. He waited. The full moon was last night. If Lyra is right, the Gray One's growths are at their weakest now, thinnest of all. If Lyra is wrong, Daniel will be the last to know. He waited 3 hours. The sun rose. Light filtered through the ailing tree crowns, grayish yellow, dull. Then he heard it. Not footsteps. Breathing. Heavy. Slow. Like the bellows of a blacksmith's forge. The bear was breathing, and the forest was breathing with him. Daniel saw him a minute later. Gray stepped onto the trail 200 paces away. and Daniel understood why they called him Gray.
His fur, not gray, not white, silvery, like metal, like the blade of an old knife. Growths covered his shoulders and spine like armor, but Daniel saw it right away. Lyra was right. The growths were thinner than he'd expected. In places, fur showed through between the plates. Cracks, shedding. The old armor was coming off. The new armor hadn't grown in yet. Now or never. The gray wolf walked along the trail, slowly. He found the first piece of bait, sniffed it, ate it, moved on. The second, the third. He moved from piece to piece just like Daniel, calculating. The bait was leading him to the passage. Daniel held his breath. His hands didn't tremble. Strange. He'd been shaking when he hunted the first wolf, with the first wild boar, too. Not now. Maybe because the fear had passed. Maybe because the wooden bear in his pocket weighed more than real fear. The gray-haired one approached the passage between the rocks. He stopped. He sniffed the air. Daniel was up above. The wind was blowing from the bear toward him. The bear couldn't smell him, but he could smell something. He stood there, sniffing. A minute. 2. Daniel waited. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The gray-haired man entered the passage. Its sides scraped against the rock. It was enormous, wider than Daniel remembered from the tracks. Its head was lowered. Eyes. 4. 2 main ones, 2 small ones on its forehead. All 4 were looking straight ahead, at the last piece of bait beyond the passage. The bear had gone halfway through, 3/4 of the way. Its hind legs had passed the wedge. Now, Daniel yanked the rope. The wedge came loose. The log fell. 100 kilograms of raw wood crashed down on the bear's back. The grizzly roared. The sound struck his ears like a hammer. The bear sank to the ground. Its front paws buckled. The log pinned it to the ground. The growths on its back cracked under the weight. Daniel jumped from the ledge, 2 meters down, onto the bear's back, onto the log. His feet landed on the wet, slippery wood. He fell to his knees, the knife in his right hand. The left shoulder blade. He could see it, beneath the fur. The growths were thinner there. Cracks, shedding, an opening. The knife went in. The blade cut through the bony growth as easily as through clay. 1 centimeter, 2, 5, 10, deeper. Daniel pressed down with all his weight. The knife sank in up to the hilt. The bear jerked. The log shifted. Daniel was thrown to the side. His back slammed against the rock. Pain. His right side. Something cracked. A rib. Maybe 2. He lay on the ground between the rock and the bear. The gray-haired man was getting up. The log slid off his back. The knife was sticking out from under his shoulder blade, hilt and all. Blood was flowing. Dark. Thick. The bear turned around in the passageway. He couldn't turn completely. It was too narrow, but his head turned, and 4 eyes found Daniel. The bear struck with his paw, his right one. It struck the wall of the passageway above Daniel's head. Stone splintered into fragments. Daniel rolled back. The pain in his side was blinding, but he kept rolling, toward the exit of the passageway, away. The gray-haired man was following him, slowly. Blood was flowing down his left side. The knife was lodged deep. His lung. His heart was nearby. Maybe it was hit. Maybe not. The bear emerged from the passageway. He took 4 steps. He stopped. He stood there. He was breathing, heavily, with a wheeze. Blood dripped onto the ground. Daniel lay 10 steps away and looked at him. Nothing between them, only air. If the bear took 10 more steps, Daniel would die. He had only a machete, against a 400-pound beast with 4 eyes. The gray-haired man stood there. It stared. 4 eyes on Daniel. Daniel on 4 eyes. Then the bear lay down, slowly, the way a very old creature lies down. Its front paws folded under, then the back ones. It lay on its side, its right side. Its left side, with the knife, faced the sky. The blood stopped dripping. It flowed. Daniel waited. 10 minutes. 20. The bear didn't move. It was breathing. Less and less, less and less. Then it stopped. Daniel lay there for another 10 minutes. Then he stood up. A rib on his right side was dislocated. Every breath felt like a knife from the inside. He walked over to the bear. The grizzly lay on its side, huge. Its silvery fur was covered in blood. Its eyes were open, all 4 of them, dead. Daniel placed his hand on its head. He stood there for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Thank you. You fed the forest for 10 years. Now you'll feed the village." He pulled out his cleaver and began to work, butchering a 400-kilogram bear.
alone, with a single cleaver, with 2 broken ribs, in the woods. It was the longest butchery of his life, 6 hours. Every movement sent pain shooting through his side. He skinned it. Beneath the skin lay muscles, huge, red, healthy. There were growths on the surface, under the skin. Not deep, shedding. They were coming off. Inside, the bear was cleaner than any beast Daniel had ever butchered here. He found 3 distortion knots. Only 3, small ones, at the base of the skull, in the groin, and one near the heart. The heart. 1. Huge, the size of 2 of Daniel's fists. Daniel cut out the knots, set them aside. He looked at the carcass. Enough meat to last the whole winter, for the entire village. He couldn't carry it all by himself, not even a tenth of it. He took the liver. He took the heart. He took the tongue. He wrapped them in the hide, tied them with a rope, dragged them toward the village. The journey took 4 hours. He stopped every 20 steps. He lay down. He caught his breath. He clutched his side. He got up. He dragged it on. At the edge of the forest, Ben met him. The old man was sitting on his stump, as always. He saw Daniel. He saw the blood on his jacket. He saw the bundle wrapped in hide. Ben stood up, silently. He took part of the load. They walked to the village together. At the outskirts, all 43 people were waiting for them, with torches, in silence. At the front stood Mira, holding Annie in her arms. Daniel walked, taking one step after step. He reached them, and sank to his knees in the first snow, because he couldn't stand. Mira set Annie down on the ground. She walked over to him. She hugged him, silently, tightly, as she had never hugged anyone in her life. Annie pressed herself against his wounded side. It hurt, but he didn't flinch. Annie whispered into his jacket that he'd been gone a long time, that she'd been waiting and hadn't eaten dinner. Daniel laughed, loudly, out loud. For the first time since waking up in this world, he laughed out of pain and happiness at the same time. He took a wooden bear figurine out of his pocket, a whole one. He placed it in Annie's hand. He said he had a bear there, a real one. It would last all winter. Annie pressed the figurine to her chest and said she knew, that Dad always brings one. The crowd parted. Daniel stood up. Myra offered her shoulder. He leaned on it. They walked toward the house. Smoke was already rising above the roof. Sadie had lit the smokehouse without waiting. In the morning, Daniel sent Tom and Sadie with 2 men to the cliffs to fetch the carcass. They returned by evening, the carcass on 2 carts, 400 kilograms. The village watched in silence. Then Ben said quietly, "For the butcher, who gave us back our table." No one repeated it. Everyone just stood there, and Annie cried because of the significance of the moment without understanding why. That night, Daniel lay on a cot with his side bandaged. Lyra applied a tight bandage with yarrow ointment. The rib will heal in 3 weeks, maybe 4. Mira lay next to him, not a hand's breadth away, but right up against him. Her hand rested on his chest. She didn't say a word. She just lay there beside him. And for the first time, Daniel thought that this house smelled right. Smoke, meat, warmth, home. Winter came a week after the hunt for the gray one, abruptly, overnight. In the morning, the ground was white. The stream had frozen at its banks. The air grew so cold that his breath hung in a cloud. Daniel stood by the smokehouse and looked at the snow. White, not gray. Around the village, the snow lay white, pure. Further toward the forest, it was gray, with a yellowish tint, like everything else here. But around Hollow End, within a radius of 100 steps, the snow was white. Ben was the first to notice it. He walked up to Daniel and said that the snow was white, that he couldn't remember the last time he'd seen white snow in Hollow End. Daniel looked at the snow, then at the forest, then at his hands. He said nothing, but he thought. 3 months ago, he'd woken up in a stranger's body in a dead village. Since then, he'd butchered 27 beasts. From each, he'd cut out distortion knots. 27 beasts, more than 100 knots. And around the village, the snow was white. He didn't know why. He didn't know the connection, but he sensed that there was one. Winter had taken its toll on the village. The first 2 weeks were hard. The cold seeped through the cracks in the walls. The wind from the forest carried the smell of rot and frozen earth. The firewood ran out quickly. Daniel organized a wood-gathering effort. 4 men chopped trees at the edge of the forest, not deep inside the woods, at the edge. Diseased trees with swollen bark. Firewood from them burned worse than from healthy ones. But it burned. The smokehouse ran non-stop. Daniel smoked Sadoy's meat in batches. Bear meat is tougher than wild boar. The fibers are thicker. It needs to be smoked longer, at a lower temperature. He found the right process on the third batch. Low smoke, cherry and alder wood chips, 12 hours. The meat turned out dark, dense, with a deep flavor, filling. One chunk and a grown man wouldn't want to eat for 4 hours. From a 400-kilogram carcass, he got 220 kilograms of lean meat. The rest was bones, fat, hide, and entrails. The bones went into the broth. He rendered the fat and poured it into pots. Bear fat is thick and yellow. It burns evenly. You can be used as fuel for lamps. It can be rubbed on the skin to protect against the cold. It can be used for cooking. The bear's hide, huge. Lyra said it could be made into 3 blankets. Mira spent 4 days tanning it. Her hands were covered in fat and hide up to her elbows. But she didn't complain. She just worked. The hide turned out soft and warm. Daniel gave the first blanket to a family with 2 children. The parents were young. The father was Tom himself. His wife was Rena. The children were small, 3 years old and 1 year old. They were the ones who felt the cold the most. The second blanket went to Ben and Oldie. They were elderly. The cold was more dangerous to them than hunger. The third one stayed at home, for Annie. The little girl slept under the bearskin and said the bear was keeping her warm. Daniel didn't correct her. Let the bear keep her warm. 3 weeks later, the rib had healed. Lyra checked it every day. She changed the bandage, an ointment made from yarrow and bear fat. It works. In the 4th week of winter, Daniel went hunting again for the first time. Not far, to the edge of the forest. Snares for hares. Small game, but important. Fresh meat for a change. The body can't live on smoked meat alone. We need fresh meat. We need offal. We need broth. Broth every day. For Annie, for the old folks, for everyone. By midwinter, a routine had settled in at Hollow End. Morning, broth. Breakfast. Daniel hands out the portions. To each his own. Ben gets the brain bone. Oldie gets his without fat. Annie gets a little star cut out of a carrot, which he carves every morning. 43 bowls. 43 names. Then work. Daniel at the smokehouse, Sadie at the cutting table, Tom chopping wood and setting traps, Lyra in her hut with herbs and ointments, Dex at the forge, Myra tanning hides and sewing. Griffin is in charge. Evening. Dinner. A communal table, a long one, made from planks from the smokehouse. Everyone together, 43 people. It had become a tradition after the hunt for the gray one. Every evening, a communal table. Daniel cooked, stewed meat or ribs or soup, always something different. Always with whatever was available. Wild onions from under the snow, dried mushrooms, roots, whatever Lyra found, whatever Annie gathered with her. Annie had become Lyra's shadow. She followed her everywhere. She asked about every little plant. Lyra answered patiently. She pointed them out. Let her smell them. Let her taste them. Annie memorized them. By the age of 5, she could identify 12 herbs by their smell and appearance. Daniel watched this and thought of Lily, his daughter from a past life. Lily was 4. She loved pancakes. He doesn't know what happened to her. He'll never know. But Annie is here. Annie is alive. Annie runs. Annie learns. Every evening, Annie asks for a story about how Daddy outwitted the wild boar. Daniel tells it, a little differently each time. Annie notices the changes and corrects him. No, Dad, you said the boar was on the left, not the right. Daniel agrees. Sorry, kid, on the left. By the end of winter, Griffin came to Daniel with a question. He said that in the spring, they needed to think about the land. The fields around the village have been dead for 5 years. Nothing grows, just gray earth. But there are 3 small patches closer to the stream where wild onions sprouted last fall, on their own, without being planted. So the soil there isn't completely dead. If we dig it up and sow seeds, maybe something will grow. Daniel listened. Then he asked what they usually do with land that won't yield a crop. Griffin said nothing. They abandon it, move on. There's plenty of land in the kingdom. They leave the barren land alone. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said he knew a way. In Chicago, at a restaurant. Their supplier, Farmer Joe, grew vegetables on barren soil next to an old factory. The soil was contaminated with chemicals. Farmer Joe covered it with compost. 3 years of compost, and the soil came back to life. Compost is decomposed organic matter, manure, leaves, food scraps, bones. He told Griffin that he knew what to put on the fields. Bones, the very same bones he uses to make broth. After boiling, they're soft. They crumble. Grind them up and work them into the soil. Bone meal, phosphorus, calcium, just what the barren soil needs, and more. Ash from the smokehouse, potassium, humus from the tripe he hadn't used and had buried behind the house, nitrogen. 3 elements: phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen. He didn't remember the exact proportions. He wasn't a farmer, but he remembered what Farmer Joe had said. Bones and ash are half the battle. The other half is time and weight. Griffin listened, and his eyes grew wider. He asked how Aiden knew about the soil. He was a hunter, after all. Daniel replied with his usual, "He just knows, that's all." They'd started preparing the fields back in the winter. They'd gathered bones, crushed them with stones, ash from the smokehouse and hearths, humus. They'd piled it all up. By spring, they had enough to cover 3 plots by the stream. A thin layer. Not perfect, but a start. The last week of winter, Daniel stood at the communal table and handed out dinner. Braised bear meat with parsnip roots that Lyra had dug up from under the snow. 43 bowls, 1 for each person. Bennu got one with a brain bone. Oldie got his without fat. Annie got a parsnip star instead of a carrot because they were out of carrots. Daniel reached the last bowl, his own. He sat down, picked up a spoon, and Mira put her hand on his shoulder. For the first time, in front of everyone, her hand on his shoulder, warm, heavy. Ben stood up, slowly, leaning on his cane, and he said quietly, "For the butcher, who gave us back our table." Everyone stood up, 43 people, in silence. Annie was standing on a bench because otherwise no one could see her. She was crying, quietly, not out of grief, out of something she didn't understand. Daniel was sitting. He didn't stand up. He stared at his bowl. In the bowl was stewed meat and a piece of parsnip. Just food. But behind that bowl lay 3 months, 27 animals, 2 broken ribs, 1 smokehouse, 43 names, and a wooden bear in his pocket. Spring arrived wet and angry. The snow melted in 3 streams, and the creek overflowed its banks for 2 days. It flooded the lower vegetable garden. It washed away a sack of salt that Sadie hadn't had time to move. Daniel stood knee-deep in water, pulling sacks of bone meal out of the mud. He cursed. Quietly, under his breath, like in the kitchen when an apprentice drops a sauceboat in the middle of service. Mira stood nearby, hauling them out too, silently, without asking questions. They worked together, and Daniel caught himself thinking that her movements had come to resemble his, precise, without any excess. She'd learned this over the winter, not because he taught her, because she lived nearby. The water receded on the 3rd day. The earth remained, wet, heavy, gray. But in 3 patches by the stream, where bone meal and ash had been spread in the fall, the earth was a different shade, darker, almost brown. Griffin crouched down. He picked up a clump of soil. He crumbled it between his fingers. He sniffed it, looked at Daniel, said it smelled like soil, real soil, for the first time in 5 years. They planted the 3 plots, wheat. Talbot had brought the seeds at Haley's request. She'd come with him this time, her 3rd visit. The van was heavier than usual. Salt, moo, ka, iron, seeds, cloth, thread, 2 goats. Talbot was expanding his selection because he had something to offer in exchange. Smoked meat from Hollow End had become a commodity in Greyhaven. Not just a commodity, a legend. People paid triple the price. Not for the taste, for the story. Meat from a cursed beast that doesn't kill. A village that came back to life. A butcher who knows. Haley brought the news. In Greyhaven, everyone is talking about Hollow End. Merchants, artisans, soldiers, and not just in Greyhaven. Rumors have reached the county seat, to church parishes, to noble salons. A man who eats the cursed meat and doesn't die, who feeds the curse to others and they too do not die, who cleans the meat of its taint with his own hands. To some, it's a miracle. To others, heresy. Haley said the church had started asking questions, quietly for now, through 3rd parties for now, but they're asking. Daniel listened and nodded. He'd been waiting for this. He'd been waiting from the very beginning. A world where a curse is explained as the will of the gods will not accept a man who explains a curse in terms of glands and lymph nodes. It's only a matter of time. He told Haley he was ready. Haley asked what exactly he was ready for. Daniel said he was ready for a conversation. Haley looked at him and said that the church doesn't talk, the church interrogates. Daniel replied that an interrogation is also a conversation. It's just that there's 1 person sitting at the table, not 2. Haley shook her head and walked over to the van. In the 4th week of spring, the wheat sprouted on 2 of the 3 plots. Green shoots, thin, weak, but green. Not black, not gray, green. Griffin knelt by the garden bed and touched a sprout with his finger. His hands were shaking. He wasn't crying. He was too old and too gaunt to cry, but his hands were shaking. He said this was the first green in 5 years, that the earth had returned. Daniel stood nearby, thinking of something else. 27 beasts, more than 100 knots of distortion, white snow, living earth. He was beginning to understand. Not with his mind, with something deeper. Every knot he cut from the carcass of a cursed beast was a thread of something vast, of a web that had kept this land dead for 200 years. He hadn't broken the curse on purpose. He was just doing his job, cutting it open, removing what was diseased, leaving what was healthy. And the land responded. In the 6th week of spring, people arrived in Hollowend. 3 of them, from Turnmore, from the village of Lyra. 2 guys and a girl, young, hungry. They said they'd heard about the butcher, about food, about work. They came to ask for a job. Griffin looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the newcomers. He asked what they could do. The first young man said he could do carpentry. The second said he could fish. The young woman said she could sew. Daniel nodded. A carpenter was needed. A fisherman was needed. A seamstress was needed. He said there would be food. Work, too. 3 new houses by summer. 3 new people. 46. A week later, 2 more arrived. Then 4. By the start of summer, 59 people were living in Hollowend, more than in the past 3 years combined. Daniel expanded production. A second smokehouse, bigger than the first, made of stone. Dex helped with the masonry. A carpenter from Turnmore put on the roof. Sadie oversaw the smoking process on her own. Daniel just checked on her. Her touch had become precise. The cuts were clean. The lines were even. She stopped asking where to place the knife. She knew. Tom had grown up too. He didn't become a master like Sadie, but he became a reliable worker. He set snares. He checked the traps. He brought in small game every day. Hares, birds, sometimes foxes. Lyra expanded her practice. Not the room, her practice. She now treated patients from beyond Hollowend. People came from neighboring villages, with sick children, with wounds, with fevers. Lyra provided ointments, decoctions, and recipes. Skull bone broth with oak bark, liver pate with yarrow, a bear fat compress with juniper. Each recipe was a combination of what Daniel had taught her and what she already knew. 2 people who worked with scraps and turned them into medicine. By midsummer, Daniel had begun teaching new people, not just butchering, everything. How to set a trap, how to read tracks, how to determine a beast's age by the wear on its teeth, how to find distortion nodes without cutting open the carcass, by smell, by the color of the fur around the growth, by the thickness of the hide. He taught 7 of them. Tom, Sadie, 2 girls from Turnmore, 3 guys who joined later, a butchering school. No walls, no desks, a table under a canopy and carcasses, a new carcass every day, each carcass a textbook. Sadie became the senior apprentice. She taught the younger ones when Daniel was out hunting. She repeated his words, his movements, his rules. Run the knife along the bone, not across it. Sniff before you cut. Thank every animal. Daniel heard her say these things and recognized his own words in a stranger's voice. A strange feeling. In Chicago, he'd had apprentices. They came and went. No one stayed long. Here, the apprentices stayed because they had nowhere else to go. Because here there was food and work and purpose. That summer, Haley arrived alone, without Talbot, on her own horse, with 2 heavy bags. She said she'd split from Talbot, officially. She's trading on her own, under the name Marks. Smoked tongues from Hollow End bear her brand. They know about it in Greyhaven, in the 2 neighboring towns, too. The name Marks is on everyone's lips again. She brought money, real money, silver coins, 20 of them. Daniel's share of the sales for 3 months. Daniel took the coins. He looked at them. His first money in half a year. In Chicago, he used to make $3,000 a week. Here, 20 silver coins for 3 months. But these 20 silver coins meant more. He gave 10 to Griffin for the village's needs, 5 to Dex for iron for the forge, 3 to Lyra for medicinal herb seeds. He kept 2 for Annie. She'd need them someday. Haley watched him, watched how he handed out the money, not to himself, to others. She said quietly that he was the worst businessman she'd ever seen. Daniel replied that he wasn't a businessman. He was a butcher. A butcher feeds people. Money is a tool, like a knife. A knife isn't meant to sit in its sheath. A knife is meant to cut. Money isn't meant to be hoarded. Money is meant to be turned into food and warmth and life. Haley stood there and watched him. Then she said that someday he'd ruin her. But until that happened, she'd be by his side. She left in the morning. She looked back once on the road, just once. Sister Corvin arrived at the end of summer, alone, on a gray horse, in dark robes with a silver chain across her chest, the interrogator's chain, a symbol of the church's inquisition. Daniel saw her from the road as he was returning from the forest with 2 hares tied to his belt. A woman of about 27, pale, thin, not from hunger, from exhaustion that sleep couldn't ease. Her eyes were dark and watchful. She dismounted by the well. She asked for water. Ben gave it to her. Ben gave it to everyone. She drank and looked out at the village, at the smoke rising from the 2 smokehouses, at the butchering tables, at the people walking with knives at their belts like soldiers with swords, at the rows of green wheat by the stream, at the children running around the yard. Daniel approached. She looked at him, at the hairs on his belt, at the knives, at his hands marked with old scars from cuts. She said she was Sister Corvin, that she had been sent by the Diocese of Veldmar to investigate the circumstances surrounding the consumption of the flesh of the cursed beasts by the residents of the Hollow End settlement. Her voice was even, or formal, without threat, without warmth, like a document being read aloud. Daniel nodded. He asked if she had eaten today. Corvin blinked. She said it had nothing to do with the inquiry. Daniel said it did, because a hungry interrogator is an angry interrogator, and an angry interrogator doesn't listen well. So he invited her to sit down at the table. Corwin stood there and looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she sat down. Daniel went over to the smokehouse. He returned 20 minutes later. He set a bowl in front of her. Soup, bear broth with wild onions and parsnip root. Thick, hot. Steam rose and it smelled like home. Corvin looked at the bowl. She asked if this was the cursed meat. Daniel said the broth was made from a bear bone. The bear was cursed. The bone was clean. The knots had been cut out. The poison had been removed. It was food. Corwin didn't eat. She sat there staring at the bowl. Then she took a scroll out of her bag. She unrolled it. She began asking questions. When had people started eating it? Who was the first to eat it? How many people had been affected? What were the symptoms? Daniel answered, calmly, exactly. It started 3 months ago. He was the first to eat it. 0 people affected, 0 symptoms. 59 people eat it regularly. Everyone is alive. Everyone is healthy. 3 have gained weight. 2 elderly people no longer have joint pain. 4 children grew 2 fingers over the summer. Corvin took notes, quickly, in small handwriting. Then she looked up. She asked how he cleansed the meat of defilement. Daniel said it wasn't about defilement. It was about poison. Defilement is a word of the church. Poison is a butcher's word. The beast is cursed, but the curse doesn't lie in the meat. The curse lies in specific glands, the adrenal glands, the lymph nodes, the bone spurs. Cut them out, and the meat is clean. Corvin stopped writing. She looked at him. She said that the church teaches that the curse permeates the beast's entire being, every bone, every muscle, every drop of blood, that you cannot separate the cursed from the clean, that it's heresy. Daniel stood up silently. He told her to follow him. She stood up. She followed. He led her to the cutting table. A fresh wild boar carcass lay on the table. A morning catch. Tom had brought it. It hadn't been butchered yet. Daniel took a knife made from bone growth, a dark gray blade. Corvin looked at the knife with interest. Daniel began to work. He cut open the carcass. He showed her the entrails. Here are the kidneys, red, healthy. Here's the liver, dark but clean. Here's the heart, normal. Here's the stomach, normal. And here, he poked the knife into the growth at the base of the skull, blackish green, firm, the size of a walnut. This right here, this is the source. Everything else is healthy, only this is diseased. He made an incision in the growth, carefully, along the edge. He pulled. The growth came away from the tissue in one piece. The meat underneath was a normal color, no blackness, no rot, clean. Daniel placed the growth on the edge of the table. He placed a piece of meat from beneath the growth next to it. He said, "Here's the heresy. Eat." Corvin looked at the growth, at the meat, at Daniel, for a long time. Then she picked up a piece of meat. She sniffed it. Ordinary meat. She put it in her mouth, chewed, swallowed. She stood there and waited. Nothing. Her stomach didn't churn. Her head didn't spin. The meat was just meat.
She returned to the table. The bowl of soup had grown cold. She sat down, picked up a spoon, and began to eat, silently, until the bowl was empty.
When the bowl was empty, she set it down on the table. She looked at Daniel. She said she still had questions, but they'll have to wait until tomorrow. Right now, she wants to sleep. Griffin had set aside a house for her, empty, clean. Mira brought her a deerskin blanket. Corvin thanked her. She lay down. In the morning, she went out early. She walked around the village. She talked to people, to Ben, with Oldie, with young families. She didn't ask about the cursed meat. She asked about life, how long they'd been here, what they used to do, how things were afterward. Ben talked about joints. Oldie talked about sleep. Tom talked about work. Sadie talked about butchering. Everyone told their own story, and in every story there was Daniel, the butcher, the one who came and changed everything. Corvin listened. She took notes. By evening, she went to see Daniel. She sat down by the smokehouse. He was stoking the fire with wood chips. She said she'd served the church for 15 years, that she'd believed every word of the doctrine, that the curse was the God's punishment for the sin of the priest Orvin, that the cursed flesh was cursed in its entirety, that the curse could only be healed through prayer, that this is what she had been taught, that this is what she had believed. And then she came here and saw wheat growing on barren land, and children running and laughing, and old people who weren't sick, and a butcher who cuts out heresy with a knife and puts it on the table. And everything she sees says that the doctrine lies, that the curse is not a punishment, that it is physical, that it resides in the glands, not in the soul, that it can be cut out, literally, with a knife. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. When she fell silent, he said he didn't know whether the gods were right or not, that he was a butcher, not a theologian, that he knew one thing: if there's a diseased spot in a carcass and you cut it out, the rest will be healthy. It works with meat, it works with the earth, maybe it works with a curse, too. Corvin was silent for a long time. Then she asked what he would do if the church sent an executioner instead of an investigator. Daniel said he'd feed the executioner, too. Corvin looked at him, and for the first time in 2 days, she smiled, quietly, just with her eyes. She said he was either a madman or a saint. Daniel replied that he was a butcher, and that it was time for him to check on the smokehouse. Corwin stayed in the village for a week, then for 2. A month later, she was still there. She hadn't sent a report to the diocese, not because she didn't want to. It was because she didn't know what to write. She couldn't write the truth. The truth is heresy. She couldn't write a lie because she had seen the wheat. She stayed. She took off the interrogator's chain. She hung it on a nail in her house. She began helping Lyra with herbs. She had knowledge. The church healers had taught her anatomy. She knew the Latin names of bones and muscles. Lyra knew herbs. Daniel knew meat. The 3 of them compiled a new list of recipes, 32 combinations, for every illness they'd encountered within a 2-day journey. And for the first time in 15 years, Corvin felt she was doing what she'd gone to church for, healing people, not with words, with deeds. By the fall of the 2nd year, the gray belt had begun to recede. Everyone could see it. The 3 fields around Hollow End yielded a harvest, a real one. Wheat, not black, golden. Griffin stood at the edge of the field, holding an ear of wheat in his hand. The kernels were plump, heavy. He said his grandfather had last seen wheat like this. Daniel stood nearby and did the math. 3 fields, 600 pounds of grain, enough for the winter, with a surplus. For the first time, the village wasn't dependent solely on meat. Within a 2-hour walk of Hollow End, the forest had changed. The trees at the edge stood straighter. The bark was smooth, without blisters. The leaves were greener, not completely healthy, but closer to healthy than a year ago. The animals were changing too. Daniel noticed this while butchering. The last 5 boars he'd butchered had fewer distortion knots. Not 7, and not 9, 4, 3. The last boar had 2. The growths on the hides were thinner, smaller, as if the distortion were weakening, as if something were draining its strength. Daniel knew what it was. It was him. Every knot he'd cut out over the past 1.5 years was a strand of rope. The rope was keeping the forest dead. He cut the strands one by one, not knowing how many there were, not knowing when the last one would come. He just kept cutting. Because that was his job. A butcher cuts. A butcher separates the diseased from the healthy. 2 villages had joined Hollow End. Turnmore, where Lyra came from, and Redfield, where Dex came from. Both settlements were on the brink of extinction. Daniel sent his students there. Sadie went to Turnmore for a month, to teach, to set up a smokehouse, to demonstrate butchering. She left with 2 knives on her belt and a look that left no room for doubt. She'll manage. One of the guys from school went to Redfield. With him was Dex, the blacksmith, to set up a forge and teach how to forge knives from growths. Haley expanded her business. 3 towns now bought meat from Hollowend: Greyhaven, Stoneford, and Lower Veldmar, the county seat. The name Marks was making waves. Haley came by once every 3 weeks, each time with a full van. She took the meat away. She brought back what was needed: tools, fabric, and books. Daniel had asked for books, any books, on agriculture, animal husbandry, and medicine. Haley brought 4, old, worn-out books in a language Daniel struggled to read, but he read them anyway. In the evenings, by the light of a lamp burning bear fat, Annie sat next to him and insisted that he read aloud. Daniel read about crop rotation, about fertilizers, about livestock diseases. Annie listened without understanding half the words. But she listened. She was 6. She ran around, laughed, could identify 20 herbs by their scent, knew how to hold a knife properly, even though Daniel hadn't let her cut anything yet. She thanked every carcass before Dad started working. Myra had changed, not on the outside, on the inside. She no longer looked at Daniel with caution. She looked at him like someone who knows that this man is here to stay. Not because he said so, because every morning he placed a little pot of pâté on her lap, without a word, for a year and a half. Every morning. Once she cried over that little pot, quietly, in the morning, when she thought Daniel couldn't see her. He saw her. He didn't come over. He didn't ask. He went to the smokehouse, because tears over pâté aren't grief. They're gratitude that can't be put into words. That evening, Myra hugged him from behind as he stood by the smokehouse, silently. She pressed her face against his back. She stood like that for a minute. Then she let go and went back into the house. Daniel stood there, watching the smoke. His eyes were wet, but smoke always stings the eyes. It's from the smoke. Definitely from the smoke. In the fall, the enemies came. Not just 1, 3. The church sent an official inquisitor, not Corvin, another one, Father Malthus, a man in his 50s, thin, with a wedge-shaped beard, accompanied by 3 soldiers of the church guard. He had come to find out why Sister Corvin hadn't returned or sent a report, and why rumors of heresy in Hollowend were circulating throughout the district. At the same time, a letter arrived from Lord Bren's garrison. The Lord demanded an explanation. Why was the blacklisted village trading in meat? Why was it paying taxes in meat rather than coins? Why had the captain of the Order of the Herders sent his knife to a commoner? Rovane received a reprimand. The Lord wanted to investigate the matter personally. And thirdly, a merchant arrived from Stoneford, one whom Haley had poached from a competitor, bearing a complaint, accompanied by guards and intent on closing the trade route. 3 enemies at once. Daniel stood by the smokehouse and listened as Griffin listed the problems. Griffin spoke calmly, but his fingers gripped the staff so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Corvin stood nearby, paler than usual. To her, Father Malthus was more than just an inquisitor. He was her mentor. 10 years ago, he had taught her at the seminary. He had believed in her. He had given her the chain of an interrogator, and now he had come to judge her. Daniel listened to everything. Then he said that Griffin would resolve the issue with the merchant from Stoneford. Griffin had the papers for the trade route. Lord Bren himself had crossed out the village and released it from its obligations. That meant the village was free to trade with whomever it wanted. Griffin nodded. He knew the laws better than any lord. For 5 years, that was all he'd lived on, papers and stubbornness. Daniel asked Haley to deliver Lord Bren's letter personally, along with a gift: 10 of the best smoked hams, 5 tongues, and a note, a short one. Hollowend was ready to pay its tax in meat, twice as much as required. If the Lord accepts payment in kind, the village will be a dutiful taxpayer. Haley said it was a bribe. Daniel said it was a tax, just a very generous one. Haley smirked and rode off. And Father Malthus. Daniel looked at Corwin. She was standing upright. She wasn't wearing the chains. She'd taken them off a month ago. But she stood like a person in chains. Daniel told her she wasn't alone. Corwin looked at him. She said that Malthus was smart, tough. You can't convince him with a meal. Daniel replied that he wasn't going to try to convince him. He was going to show him. That morning, he met Malthus at the communal table. He invited him to watch the butchering. Malthus refused. He said he wouldn't take part in heresy. Daniel said he wasn't asking him to take part. He was asking him to watch. Malthus watched. Daniel butchered the boar, slowly, demonstrating every step, not to Malthus, to the students. He was teaching a lesson, a routine one, just like every day. Malthus stood to the side and watched, at Daniel's hands, at the knives, at how he found the growths, at how he cut them out with a single precise movement, at how the meat beneath the growth turned out to be clean and healthy. Malthus watched for 2 hours, then he went home, locked himself in.
Didn't come out until evening. The next morning, Malthus came to Daniel. He sat down across from him. He said what he'd seen, what he'd realized, that the meat really was clean. But that doesn't change the doctrine. The doctrine says that the curse is indivisible. If the butcher can separate the cursed from the clean and the unclean, then the doctrine is wrong. And the doctrine cannot be wrong because the doctrine is the word of God. Therefore, either the butcher is lying or the butcher is an instrument of darkness. Daniel listened. Then he asked quietly, "What if the doctrine is wrong?" Malthus fell silent. It was a question to which he had no answer, because if the doctrine is wrong about one thing, it could be wrong about everything. And then the 15 years that Corvin had devoted to the church and the 30 years that he had devoted to it would be nothing but emptiness. Daniel didn't press the issue. He stood up. He brought a bowl of broth. He set it down in front of Malthus. He said the broth was made from a bear's bone, that the bear had been cursed, that the broth was pure, and that Malthus could eat it or not. It was his choice. Malthus looked at the bowl, then at Corvin, who was standing by the door. Then he picked up a spoon and began to eat. Corvin closed her eyes. Daniel left. Malthus left 3 days later, without a verdict, without charges. He said he would file a report, that in the report he would write that Investigator Corvin was continuing the investigation, and that there were no final conclusions yet. It was neither the truth nor a lie. It was a reprieve, time that Malthus was giving himself to decide what he believed in, the doctrine or the broth. In the winter of the 2nd year, Daniel heard the forest for the first time, not with his ears, in a dream. He was lying on a cot next to Myra. Annie was sleeping by the wall, wrapped in a bearskin. The house was warm. Snow was falling outside the window, white, just like last winter. The white snow around Hollow End had spread. Now the white zone stretched half a mile in every direction. Beyond that, it was gray. But half a mile of pure snow, that was more than anyone had seen in 200 years. Daniel fell asleep and had a dream. A forest, but not a sick one, a healthy one. Green. The trees were straight, tall. Light streamed through the canopy in golden pillars. Warm air, the scent of pine needles and honey. A man was sitting at the roots of a large oak tree. An old man. His beard was white down to his waist. His eyes were green like foliage. He had tattoos on his arms, not of plants, of animals. Deer, wolves, bears, birds. His entire arm was covered from wrist to shoulder. The man looked at Daniel and said nothing. Then he said one word, "Thank you." Daniel woke up. He was lying in the dark. His heart was beating steadily. No fear, no anxiety. Warmth, like after a good broth. He knew who it was. The priest, Orvin, the one whose bones lie somewhere deep in the forest, the one who, 200 years ago, bound his blood to the earth before his execution, the one whose curse kept 7 villages in a gray death. He said thank you. Daniel didn't know what for, but he knew what to do next. In the morning, he told Lyra. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said she knew, that her mother had told her about Orvin, that he was a forest priest, that he hadn't cursed the land, he had bound his life to it, his pain, his fear of death. A curse is not revenge. A curse is a cry. The cry of a man who was killed and never buried, whose bones were thrown into the forest, whose soul has found no rest. The forest has been screaming his cry for 200 years, and the beasts carry his pain within them. The knots of distortion are clumps of that cry, physical, tangible, black and green. Every knot Daniel cuts away is one cry set free, one pain set free. Daniel listened. Then he asked where the bones were. Lyra said she didn't know for sure, but her mother had spoken of a place deep in the forest, an old oak, the biggest one, at its roots. Corvin added. She said there was a record of Orvin's execution in the church archives. They'd ordered his body to be thrown into the woods, not buried, not burned, just thrown away, so the beasts could tear it apart. It was part of the punishment, desecration of the body, a ban on burial. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he said it was time. Lyra looked at him. We asked, "Time for what?" Daniel replied, "Time to finish the butchering." It was spring of the 2nd year. Daniel had been preparing for the expedition for 2 months, not for a hunt, for an expedition, deep into the forest.
to a place where no one had gone since the gamekeeper's squad 10 years ago, to the place from which one man had emerged without an arm, to the place where Gray lived, who is no longer with us. Daniel assembled the team: Tom, Sadie, Lyra, Corvin. 4 of them, 5 including him. Griffin wanted to go. Daniel said no. The village couldn't be left without a chief. Haley wanted to go. Daniel said no. The trade route couldn't be left without Haley. Mira didn't ask to go. She knew her place was at home, with Annie, with the village. She knew Daniel would come back, not because she believed his words, because he always came back. Annie came up to him that morning before he left. She gave him a wooden bear, that very one. She said the bear would protect him. Daniel took it, put it in his pocket, kissed her on the forehead. He said he'd be back in a week. Annie nodded, seriously, like a grown-up. The 5 of them entered the forest. Daniel led the way. A knife made from a bone growth hung from his belt, a cleaver, Rovaine's knife. 3 knives, 3 levels of craftsmanship, rough, medium, precise. They walked for 2 days, through the territory where Gray lived. Empty, without its master, the territory lay open. The deer were gone, the wolves were gone. The forest here was quieter than at the edge, not dead, waiting. On the 3rd day, they came to an oak tree. Daniel recognized it, from a dream, huge, a trunk 4 spans around, a wide crown, but sick. The leaves were yellow with black spots. The bark was swollen with bumps. The roots jutted out of the ground like thick snakes. At the base of the trunk, the earth was different, black, not gray, black, like coal. Lyra crouched down. She touched it. She said the earth was hot, warm, like a body. Daniel dropped to his knees. He started digging, with his hands. Tom helped. Sadie helped. They dug for an hour. 2 elbows deep, they found bones. Human. Old. 200 years in the ground, but not crumbled, intact, as if something had preserved them. A skull, a spine, ribs, a pelvis, limbs. Everything in place, as if the body had been laid there carefully rather than thrown away. The forest had preserved it. Around the bones in the ground were growths, dozens of them, black and green, dense, pulsating, like hearts. They grew out of the ground and wove themselves into the bones. They entangled the ribs. They wrapped around the spine. They passed through the eye sockets of the skull. It was a curse, not a metaphor. The physical body of a curse. Knots, strands, roots, all made of the same substance as the growths on the beasts. But here was the source, the mother rock. From here it had grown for 200 years, into beasts, into trees, into the earth, into the water, into everything. Daniel knelt and looked at it. 200 years of pain turned into flesh. 200 years of a scream turned into a growth. He took out a knife made of bone growth, a blade that Dex had forged from the same material. Growth against growth, pain against pain. He began to cut, as if on a butcher's block. The knife follows the border, between bone and growth, between man and curse. Carefully, slowly. Every cut is precise. Every growth is separated from the bone in one piece, without damaging, without breaking, letting go. He worked for 6 hours, without a break. Tom and Sadie stood nearby and watched. Lyra held the torch. Corvin prayed, quietly. Not a church prayer, her own. For the man who was killed and never buried. For the priest who loved the forest, and whom the forest loved in return. Daniel cut the last growth from the last rib. He laid it on the ground. He stood up. The bones lay in the pit, clean, white, without a single growth, freed. The earth around them had cooled. It had grown cold, ordinary, dead earth without a curse. Lyra bent down and gathered the bones, carefully, each one. She placed them in a canvas bag. Corvin helped. They carried the bones together. They carried the bones for 2 days, through a forest that was changing before their eyes. Daniel walked ahead and saw it. Trees that had stood with swollen bark in the morning stood smooth by evening. Leaves that had been yellow with black spots turned green within hours. Not completely, but they were turning green. The ground beneath their feet was changing, from gray to brown, from dead to alive. The streams that had been flowing with murky water were clearing up. Daniel stopped and listened. Birds. For the first time in this forest, he heard birds. Not many. 1, 2. Somewhere high up in the treetops, a faint voice, like the first note after a long silence. Sadie walked behind him, saying nothing. She saw the same thing. Tom carried some of the bones and kept glancing back. Lyra walked with her eyes closed. She was listening to the forest. Corvin was carrying a skull, wrapped in canvas. He held it to his chest like a child. They merged from the forest at sunset on the second day. Ben met them at the edge of the forest, on his stump, as always. The old man saw the procession, 5 people with bones in their hands. He stood up, took off his hat, asked nothing. He understood. In the village, Daniel chose a spot, a hill beyond the stream, small, dry, with a view of both the forest and the village, so that Orvin could see both what he loved and those he had fed. The whole village dug the grave, 59 people. Everyone brought a shovel or a stick or just their bare hands. The hole turned out deep and even. Daniel climbed down into it. Lyra handed him the bones, one by one. He arranged them at the bottom, carefully, as if on a butcher's block. Each bone in its place, the skull, the spine, vertebra by vertebra, the ribs, the arms, the legs. He assembled the skeleton just as he had assembled carcasses, from memory, from knowledge. 220 muscles of an ungulate by heart, 206 human bones, too. When the last bone fell into place, Daniel straightened up. He looked down. A man, whole, assembled. After 200 years of being torn apart, he had finally found peace. Corvin spoke the words, not church words, her own. She said that this man loved the forest, and the forest loved him, that he was killed for what he knew, that his body was abandoned without a burial, that for 200 years his pain had been the pain of the earth, that today the pain ends, that he can go. Lyra placed a bundle of herbs in the grave, the ones Orvin had known in life, yarrow, mint, wild garlic, and rowan bark. Daniel laid down the knife, that first one, dull, old, the one he'd taken into the forest on that first day, the one that started it all. He placed it on the skeleton's chest, a craftsman's tool for a craftsman. They covered it with earth, wet, brown, not gray. Daniel stood above the mound and watched. Annie stood beside him, holding his hand. Myra stood on the other side. The whole village stood behind them. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He went out of the house. He stood in the yard and looked at the forest. The moon was full. Its light fell on the trees. And Daniel saw it. The forest was breathing. Not like a sick person, like someone asleep, like a person who had finally fallen asleep after a long illness. The trees stood straighter than yesterday. The bark on the nearest pine tree was smooth, no bulges. The air smelled of pine needles, clean, without the sweetish smell of rot, without acidity, just pine needles. Daniel stood there and breathed in that air, and he felt something inside him exhale as well. 2 weeks, 3, a month. The gray belt was receding like water after a flood. Not immediately, not everywhere, but it was receding. The fields around the 7 villages began to come back to life. The earth turned brown. Grass began to sprout. The streams grew clearer. The animals were changing. Daniel butchered the last damned wild boar 2 months after Orvin's burial. The boar had a single knot of distortion, small, the size of a pea. Daniel cut it out, placed it in his palm, looked at it. Small, the last one, like the last knot on a string he'd been untangling for 2 years. He clenched his fist. The pea crunched. Black liquid oozed between his fingers. Old, sour, familiar. He wiped his hand on a rag. That's it. Half a year had passed, the summer of the 3rd year. Hollowend was unrecognizable. 7 new buildings, 2 smokehouses, a horn workshop, a butchering school with a canopy and 5 tables, a tannery for hides that Mira runs herself, Lyra and Corvin's infirmary, a population of 87 people, a trade route to 4 cities, Haley Marks, a name known from Greyhaven to the county seat. Sadie had returned from Turnmore, tanned, strong, with 2 apprentices she'd trained herself. She stood before Daniel and gave her report. The smokehouse in Turnmore is up and running. Butchering is underway. 4 have been trained. 2 can teach others. Daniel listened and nodded. Then he said that Sadie had a better touch on the hyoid bone than he did. Sadie blushed, just like the first time. She told him to stop saying that in front of people. Daniel said he said it in front of people on purpose, because it's true and people need to know. With Sadie turned away, but she didn't leave. She stood nearby. Lyra and Corvin were working together. The infirmary was taking in patients from 5 villages. 32 prescriptions had turned into 48. Lyra smiled quietly when Daniel brought her another liver, labeled with who it was for and what it was for. Corvin was writing, every evening. Not a report, a book. About how the curse turned out to be a disease. About how a butcher with a knife did what the church couldn't do with prayers. She didn't know who she was writing for. For those who would come after, Dex forged 20 knives from the bone growths, the last ones. There would be no more growths. The beasts were born pure, without deformities. Ordinary wild boars, ordinary deer, ordinary wolves. The knives made from the growths became relics, a memory of a time when the forest was sick. Haley arrived in the summer with news. Lord Bren had restored Hollow End to the tax rolls, officially, with a seal. The village existed once more, not as something that had been struck off the list, but as a full-fledged entity, with rights, with obligations, with a name. Haley placed the sealed scroll on the table in front of Daniel. She said there was something else inside. Daniel unrolled it. A charter. Lord Bren grants Aiden Court the title of Master Butcher, the first in the kingdom's history, with the right to teach, with the right to trade, with the right to carry a knife at court. Daniel looked at the charter, then at Haley.
Haley said it had been her idea, that she'd been knocking on the Chancellery's door for half a year, that Rovain had helped her. He'd written a letter to the Lord. One sentence. This man knows what no one else knows. Grant him the right to know this openly. Daniel rolled up the charter, put it away, stood up, walked over to the smokehouse. Haley watched him go. She wasn't offended. She knew him well enough to understand. A charter is just a piece of paper. A butcher doesn't work with paper. A butcher works with meat. He needs to go to the smokehouse. Evening. Late summer. The third year. Daniel stood at the communal table, a long one, made of planks, under a canopy. 87 people were seated at the table. 14 of them had been there since day one. The rest had arrived later, but they were all seated at the same table. Daniel had been cooking all day. One large pot, braised venison, plain, clean, no knots, with onions from his garden, with carrots that grew on what used to be dead soil, with potatoes that Talbot brought in the spring and that had yielded their first harvest, with salt from a mineral spring, with herbs from Lyra. A simple dish. The most complex of the simple ones, because in simplicity, there's nowhere to hide a mistake. He ladled it into bowls, for each person individually. Each got their own. Ben got one with the brain bone. You've got joints, Ben. Oldie, no extra fat. I remember Oldie, so a bigger portion for him. You worked today. Sadie, with cartilage. You love cartilage, Sadie. Don't deny it. Lyra, with herbs on top. She put them there herself. Corbin gets a piece of bread, real bread, made from his own wheat. Dex gets a marrow bone. A blacksmith needs fat. Haley gets the piece she picked out herself, because Haley always picks it out herself. Mira. He set her bowl down without a word. She looked at it. There was pâté in the bowl, a small pot, just like every morning, for 2 years, every morning. Liver, garlic, rowan berries. Mira looked at him. Daniel looked at her. She said quietly, so quietly that only he could hear her, "Thank you for coming." Daniel sat down, last, as always. He picked up a spoon. Annie was sitting next to him. A wooden bear was sticking out of her dress pocket. She said the soup was delicious, but last time the carrot star was prettier. Daniel nodded. He said he'd make it prettier next time. He promised. Ben stood up, slowly, with his cane, but he stood up. He looked at the table, at the 87 bowls, at the faces, at the smoke from the smokehouse, at the fields beyond the stream where the wheat was green, at the forest that stood green, alive, breathing. Ben said quietly, "For the butcher." Everyone stood up, 87 people, in silence. Annie stood on the bench, as always, because otherwise she couldn't see. She wasn't crying. This time she was smiling, because now she understood why everyone stood up. Daniel sat. He didn't stand up. He looked at his bowl, stewed meat, onions, carrots, potatoes, a simple meal in a simple bowl on a simple table. But behind that bowl lay everything. 3 years, 200 years of curses unleashed, one knife at a time. More than 30 animals, broken ribs, a dream in which a dead priest said thank you. The woman who gets pâté every morning and once said the one thing that needed to be said. The little girl who studies herbs and says thank you to every animal. The village that became home. The smoke that smells of life. Daniel picked up his spoon. He began to eat. Myra placed her hand on his shoulder, heavy, warm. Smoke drifted above the smokehouse. The scent of ripening wheat hung over the fields.
The forest breathed steadily. In 2 years, he hadn't told Myra the truth. He hadn't told her that he wasn't Aiden. He hadn't told her about Chicago, about the restaurant, about Lily. Maybe he'll tell her someday. Maybe not. It doesn't matter. What matters is that Annie has a wooden bear in her pocket, that Daniel has 3 knives on his belt, that there are 87 bowls on the table, that Myra said, "Thank you for coming," and they both knew what she meant. Les looked out at the village, at a single lit house in the valley that was no longer dead, and the forest exhaled, quietly, like a man who had finally let go of what he'd been holding on to for 200 years. The snow that winter was white, everywhere, all the way to the horizon.